counsel is present. Mr. Prosecutor, you want to call your next witness?
People call Joel Schulte.
Morning, Mr. Schultze. Right up here, and I'll swear you in before you sit down. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear, oath, or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you, sir. You may be seated.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
Thank you. Could you please state and spell your name for the record?
Joel, Joel, Schultze, Schultze.
Mr. Schulte, are you employed?
I am.
Where do you work?
I'm employed by the state of Michigan and assigned to the Michigan State Police Forensic Laboratory in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
What is your job?
I'm a supervisor of the DNA unit. I've been in that position for, as a supervisor for about 18 years.
And what did you do before you were a supervisor?
I was a bench analyst, a DNA analyst for Michigan State Police. Been with Michigan State Police, I'm in my 26th year, and then prior to that, I was a forensic biologist with the Chicago Police Department and Illinois State Police for about 6 years.
And what is your educational background?
I have a degree in biology and chemistry from Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I have a second degree in forensic science or criminalistics from Michigan State University.
When you started working in this field, did you receive any additional training?
Yes, correct. So when I was with the Chicago Police Department, I was considered what's called a serologist and received training to perform serology on cases, criminal cases there for Chicago Police Department. And then when I was hired by the Michigan State Police, received extensive training for forensic DNA analysis.
Could you estimate the number of hours of additional training you've received?
The initial forensic DNA training with Michigan State Police was about a year and a half. I was doing other casework during that time, serology casework, but estimated amount of training would probably be 400 or 500 hours. And within that training too, I went to the FBI training academy for 2 weeks of forensic DNA training. And then we're also required to do continuing education at least 8 hours every year. Typically we do about 16 to 24, sometimes up to 80 hours a year of continuing education each year. And I've done that, excuse me, I've done that ever since 2000 when I started doing DNA casework.
Today, we're going to be mostly focusing on DNA. So could you estimate the number of cases you've worked on in DNA analysis?
I was looking the other day for Michigan State Police. I've released over 4,000 reports. So that would include biology plus DNA. So my estimate for as far as number of cases for DNA would probably be around 2,500 to 3,000.
Have you ever testified in court before?
I have.
How many times?
Approximately 150 times in Michigan.
And have you been qualified as an expert to testify in court before?
I have.
How many times?
Every time I testified.
Your Honor, I would move that Mr. Schultze be qualified as an expert in DNA analysis.
No objection. Court would so find him an expert in that field. You may go.
Thank you. Now I'm going to ask you some questions about this case. Please be patient with me. I don't have your science background, so my questions might be a little stupid. Can you tell us about what forensic biology is and what kind of evidence you include in it?
Sure. Forensic biology has two different parts to it, and the initial part I alluded to earlier as a serologist. Currently we call that body fluid identification. So because it's related to forensics, we're looking at criminal cases and we're looking at forensic evidence. An investigating agency would seize evidence from the scene and they would submit it to the laboratory for body fluid identification, which is screening the evidence. So whether it be clothing or a sexual assault kit or anything like that, for possibility for any bodily fluids. The second part of forensic biology then would be the DNA analysis. So if they identify a bodily fluid like blood or semen or saliva that contains DNA, then they would submit that portion of that evidence to the DNA unit for DNA analysis. And what our goal in forensic biology then is to develop a DNA profile and then compare it to known DNA profiles from individuals to see if there's an association or a match.
What is DNA?
So DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and it is a molecule that's in every nucleated cell in your body. So people refer to it as the blueprint of life, or your genetic code. And it's a very complex yet basic molecule that codes for everything. So your DNA is going to code to what color your hair, your gender, whether you're short or tall, all aspects of your body.
And is DNA different from one person to another?
It is, with the exception of identical twins.
So how about within one person? Is DNA from my skin different from DNA in my blood?
No, so your DNA profile would be the same whether we develop that from skin cells or from saliva or from blood or any bodily fluid from the same individual.
If someone were to leave something containing their DNA, would exposure to the weather change their DNA?
It would not change their DNA. There are we call environmental factors or insults, we call environmental insults, that may degrade the DNA, and what that does is kind of starts breaking apart the DNA, but it will just make it a little bit more difficult to do the analysis. So different things would be like sunlight, UV from sunlight, mildew or bacteria, moisture, that kind of thing can degrade the DNA.
So when you say degrade, and you also said it makes it harder to read, is that right?
That's correct.
Could those factors make my DNA look like someone else's?
No, so it would kind of break up the DNA, and it'd be the same if you left a photograph, let's say out in the sunlight or on the dash of your car, and the sun would start to fade that photograph. It wouldn't change what that photograph was the picture of, but it may make it harder for you to actually see maybe the face of a person or a bird or whatever the photograph is of.
So that photograph would be faded, but it wouldn't look like somebody else.
It wouldn't change what's on the photograph, correct?
Is time one of those factors?
It is.
And can those, sorry, one moment. How about if DNA is mixed from more than one person? Can that look like a third person's DNA then?
It can't look like a third person, but we can tell immediately if it is a mixture of more than one person's DNA, because the DNA profiles that we develop is a series of numbers, and at each location you can either have one number or you can have two numbers, because you're getting your DNA from your parents. So if they give you two different types from your parents, you'd have two numbers there. If your parents give you the same type, you'd have one number. But as soon as we see three numbers, four numbers, or that sort of thing at each location, then we know it's a mixture of DNA, because you can't have more than two numbers at a location.
So you're talking about parents, and you mentioned identical twins before. What about siblings? Does their DNA look similar?
They can share some DNA, but it would not be like identical twins would have identical DNA profiles. But siblings, brothers and sisters, would not have the same DNA.
Now, I think we've probably all seen on television paternity results in DNA. Can you do maternity results in DNA also?
It's we refer to it to paternity basically because most of the time what we're trying to determine is the biological father. So whether that being a sexual assault, where the victim had a baby or was impregnated, then we're trying to determine the suspect being the paternity. Most cases that you see on TV or talk shows would be, who is the father of this baby? So that's why it's called paternity. Paternity, we would be able to develop, that would just be like who is the mother of this baby. Obviously, you don't hear about that because pretty much we know biological mothers of the children. Another term for that would be kinship. So who is my kin? And that would include both father and mother and child in a kinship report or analysis.
Can you do kinship analysis for siblings also?
We can. We can't compare, is this person a brother to this person, because in Michigan State Police, we're just trained for offspring, so it would be parent-child relationships. But that can be done, yes.
And as pertains specifically to this case, did you do any of that analysis for case of People v. Roy Snell?
I did.
All right. And did you prepare any reports for that case?
I did.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Handing you what's been marked as People's, that's 87. Give me this. Let me just show this. Sorry.
What number is that?
87. Do you recognize what I've just handed you?
I do.
And how do you recognize it?
It's a 3-page report from 2019 that I authored and contains my signature on page 3.
So you signed it, you created that report?
I did, yes.
Why did you create that report?
I was asked in this particular case to do a kinship analysis. And in this particular case, there was a red-brown stain from a spray bottle that it was requested to do the kinship. And if the kinship went back to a biological offspring or biological child, I should say, of Karen Atwood and Gordon Atwood, and that would now be used as an alternate known DNA sample for Richard Atwood.
Why would you have to create an alternate known? Did you have a direct DNA sample from Richard Atwood?
We did not. So those cases where we do not have a direct or a known from an individual, whether it's blood or saliva or whatever it may be, you have to find an alternate known.
Okay. And how did you go about doing this?
So first, the DNA profiles are developed, and in this case, from the red-brown stain from the spray bottle, a DNA profile was developed. You can see that it was a male DNA profile. That's one thing that our analysis can tell us whether it's male or female. And then Gordon Atwood Sr.'s and Karen Atwood DNA profiles were developed. And once those three profiles are developed, I can take that profile from that stain from the bottle, and I can compare it to the Karen Atwood's and Gordon Atwood's seniors. And like I said earlier, what you're going to do is single source profiles and have 1 or 2 DNA types, and those are simply numbers. So in let's say I'm an 1116 at a certain location. As long as my mother has an 11 in her profile or father, and the other one has a 16, I'm consistent with being a biological child because I've inherited those types from my parents. Then you move on to another location and you do the same thing. And as long as I have consistently across those locations, then in the conclusion, my conclusion would be that I'm consistent with being a biological child of these 2 parents. If at any point those numbers do not line up, or I have a type that isn't in my mother's and father's, then I'm 100% not with their child. Not their biological child. So it's pretty simple DNA analysis and kinship analysis. So once you're through the entire profile from the spray bottle, the red-brown stain from the spray bottle, comparing it to Karen Atwood and Gordon Atwood Sr., then you make a determination whether that could be that stain could have been from a biological child of those 2 people.
And what scientific method or technology do you use to accomplish that?
To do the actual comparison is just a visual comparison. You see peaks with these numbers I described earlier. The data that is generated is a whole series of steps to provide this or to come up with this DNA profile. So in this case, that data was supplied to me. So we had the DNA profile from the spray bottle, and we had the DNA profile from Karen Atwood and Gordon Atwood, and that was simply a visual comparison. Like I said, it's a pretty simple comparison, and I would think anyone in the room here could do that same visual comparison and see if any matches or not.
You say it was supplied to you. What does that mean?
In this case, there's other DNA analysts involved with the case, and particularly Catherine Meredith developed the DNA profile. She's a coworker, cohort in the laboratory. I'm trained in the kinship analysis that she's not, so that's why I got involved with the case that asked me to do the kinship analysis from the data that she generated.
And am I correct in saying that in your report, you also excluded some people?
That's correct. So we knew this was a male DNA profile on the red-brown stain from the spray bottle, and there are two other male offsprings of Gordon and Karen Atwood, and those were excluded as being donors to that red-brown stain.
How did you exclude them?
So that's just a straight, so we had Gordon Atwood Jr. and Kurt Atwood, who are siblings, I understand, of Richard Atwood. And those are just a direct comparison. So you're just looking at a series of numbers, and the series of numbers from those two, from Gordon Atwood Jr. and Kurt Atwood, and if they don't match up, they're excluded as being the source of that DNA from that stain.
Why would you only exclude Richard Atwood's brothers and not his sisters, Lynn and Annette?
Because we knew it was a male, single source male profile on that red-brown stain, so there was no point in asking for any exclusion samples from females.
So if I were to direct questions about the specific analysis that was done for the data that you were supplied, I should direct those questions to Ms. Meredith?
That's correct.
You also mentioned in there a DNA cutting, is that right?
That's correct.
What is a DNA cutting?
So in this case, a DNA cutting would be, depending on what type of sample was submitted here, and I can tell because of the identifiers, Karen Atwood and Gordon Atwood Sr. supplied what we call buccal swabs, and those are just swabs from the inside of your cheek. And as I testified earlier, that DNA is going to be the same as the DNA in your blood, so it's a less invasive way to get the DNA, and that's on a swab, and we just take a DNA cutting from that swab. We don't need the entire swab. There's so much DNA that we just need a small portion of that. So we take a small DNA cutting, that's what we develop and extract the DNA from.
So before you mentioned that you use this as an alternative sample, what was the purpose of that alternative sample going forward in the case?
So for Catherine Meredith to do her analysis, she needed to have an alternate known for Richard Atwood. So that was the purpose of my analysis, to see if that spray bottle or stain from that spray bottle was consistent with being a biological child of Karen Atwood and Gordon Atwood Sr. And then from that point on, Catherine Meredith would use that as an alternate known.
And how would you describe the methods you used in this case and your lab uses as being with the times in terms of technology?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, actually paternity, the same sort of paternity analysis has been around a lot longer than even DNA analysis. So this paternity analysis with blood types goes back decades. So this has been accepted. DNA is just a different method to do that, a little bit more specific.
And is your lab accredited?
It is.
Your Honor, at this point, I would move to admit what's been marked as People's 87.
No objection. Court would admit Exhibit 87.
I have no more questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Ms. Korndike or Ms. Smulders?
Yes, just one minute. Good morning, Mr. Schultze.
Good morning.
I wrote down to make sure I pronounced that E at the end of your name. My name is Stephanie Korndike. I represent Roy Snell along with Ms. Smulders. I'm just going to ask you a few questions. I know you stated on direct that your lab typically doesn't do the kinship analysis, correct?
not the kinship analysis, we can't do sibling comparisons.
Okay. But are you trained in that kind of analysis?
Again, well, I'm trained in kinship analysis, but what the only kinship analysis we do is parent-child kinship. So if someone came to us and said, could you see if this is a brother of this unknown person or this stain or something like that, we're not trained in doing siblings or cousins or half-brothers or anything like that, simply parent-child relationships.
Okay, so when you testified on direct that you did a kinship analysis, it was simply to determine whether or not the stain was a biological child of the samples you had for Gordy and Karen, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then did you get the samples and examine them from Mr. Atwood's other siblings?
Again, I got all the DNA data from those. They'd already been developed, those profiles. And when I said we can't do sibling analysis, that would be if we didn't have Karen Atwood and Gordon Atwood Senior's DNA, like if they were no longer available to provide that, and all you had were Richard Atwood's siblings, we would not be able to do that. Like we could send it to a different laboratory that could do that outside of Michigan, but we couldn't say that stain on that bottle is a sibling of Kurt Atwood or Gordon Atwood Jr.
Okay, so it's because you had the DNA from the parents, you were able to rule out the other siblings.
No, those are two different comparisons. I know it's a
Okay.
little confusing. So,
Yes, can you maybe walk the jury through that,
Sure.
how you do that?
Okay, sure. So we have this DNA profile from the stain from the spray bottle, and it's a single source male profile. So again, it's just a series of numbers. And then initially what I did was I compared that to Karen Atwood and Gordon Atwood Sr. to see if that could be a biological child or not. And it was consistent with being a biological child of those two individuals. Because there are more than that, because Karen and Gordon Atwood Sr. had more than one son, the others are excluded when I directly compare them to the spray bottle. I don't compare them back to the parents, if that makes sense. So Kurt Atwood and Gordon Atwood Jr. have their own DNA profiles, and I can do that directly to the stain on the spray bottle. They were excluded.
Okay, thank you. That clears it up a little bit for me. And this is kind of a basic question. Again, I'm not proficient in DNA. How do you tell if a sample is male or female?
So there is one marker we look at, the technical term is amylogenin, and if it's a female, it'll just have an X, and if it's a male, it'll have an XY. It's a very simple marker, I should say, genetic marker that we look at.
Okay. If you know, you might not know, but do you know why there was not a direct DNA sample of Mr. Atwood, Ricky Atwood?
I don't know. I can presume why, but I don't know why there wasn't one supply.
Okay, I'm gonna confer with co-counsel and. When you are provided samples, do you have to sign a chain of custody form for those samples?
If I was provided with the actual evidence itself, yes.
Okay, but there's no chain of custody that you have to sign for the analysis that you did?
Correct, not for data.
Okay. And do you have any direct knowledge of where the DNA samples that were analyzed came from?
No, just from the descriptions in our laboratory information system.
Is it possible that that would be a better question for Ms. Meredith?
It would be a better question for Ms. Meredith, although since this occurred in 1983, She was not working at the laboratory, neither was I when they were collected, so probably whoever collected those would be better ask that question.
Okay. Thank you. I have nothing further.
Redirect?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
Any questions from the jury? May this witness be excused?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, sir. You're all set for today. You may stay or go. You can leave that right there, so he'll get it. Mr. Prosecutor, your next witness.
People call Catherine Meredith.
Thank you. The witness left an exhibit of the witness stand. Right up here for me, ma'am, and I'll swear you in before you sit down. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear, oath, or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. You may have a seat. Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you, Your Honor. Could you please state your name for the record?
Catherine Meredith.
And could you spell your name for the record?
Sure. First name Katherine. Last name Merideth.
Thank you. Where are you employed?
I am employed with the Michigan State Police Forensic Science Division as a laboratory manager in the Grand Rapids Laboratory.
How long have you been employed there?
I've been employed with Michigan State Police for just under 18 years.
Did you hold a position before that somewhere else?
I've worked with Michigan State Police since I graduated from grad school.
And what is your educational background?
I have a bachelor's degree from Grand Valley State University in biology with a minor in chemistry and a master's degree in forensic science from the University of New Haven.
What are your job responsibilities?
My job responsibilities today are to manage a team of forensic scientists within our DNA unit in the laboratory. I interpret DNA evidence, I review DNA reports, I manage that team and the casework that goes with that.
Have you received additional training in your field since you completed your education?
I have initially to be trained as a forensic scientist, which was my initial role in the DNA unit. I trained for approximately 6 months to screen evidence related to criminal matters for biological material. I trained for approximately another year to do the DNA testing and analysis, and that training would have involved studying procedures, protocols, working with mock samples, working under senior analysts, case review, journal literature review, competency testing, and written examinations.
Have you testified in court before?
I have. I believe this is my 93rd time.
Have you ever been qualified as an expert in your testimony?
I have.
And in what field?
I've been qualified in crime scene response. I've been qualified in body fluid identification or the screening step, and I've been qualified in DNA analysis. Most typically, I'm qualified in forensic biology because I have training and expertise in all of those areas.
Your Honor, I would move that this witness be qualified as an expert in forensic biology.
No objection.
Court would find her an expert in forensic biology. You may go ahead, sir.
Ms. Meredith, did you have any responsibilities in this case?
I did.
And what were those?
I screened evidence related to this case. I did DNA analysis and DNA interpretations related to this case as well, and authored reports of my findings.
The last witness said that you had supplied, Mr. Schulte said that you had supplied data for him. What kind of data would that be?
So data would be the information that's generated at the completion of the DNA analysis process. That data can be interpreted by any trained, qualified DNA scientist. So the work that Mr. Schulte did with the paternity analysis, that would have been his role in this case, was data supplied from the analysis that I did and the interpretations that he used to make his conclusions.
How did you get that data or generate that data?
So our process in the biology unit is really a two-step process. We're going to screen evidence related to criminal matters for the presence of biological material. If we're able to identify biological material, we would isolate that sample, and that gets isolated into just a plastic, about 2-inch tube that we would call an extraction tube. That sample then is what we would do the chemical steps or processing for DNA analysis. That's a multi-step process that in the end we have that generated DNA profile that we make our interpretations from.
What technology do you use to create those genetic profiles?
The name of the technology is PCR-STR, or polymerase chain reaction, short tandem repeat. That's the full scientific terminology for that. But that is kind of the gold standard for forensic DNA testing in the United States and all around the world at this time. What that testing does is essentially we take that sample that we identified as a biological sample or where there could be biological material, and we have a multi-step process. That first step would be to extract or to break open that cellular material. Then we would quantify how much DNA is there. And then we would add a series of chemicals and reagents, and we would copy whatever DNA is in that sample. And that copied DNA would go on a genetic analyzer or an instrument that would allow us to generate that DNA profile. And that DNA profile or picture is what we make our interpretations from. We would make interpretations based on comparisons of evidentiary samples or unknown samples related to criminal matters. And we would make those compared to known references to determine if there are common DNA types, if there are not common DNA types, and that's what we would make our interpretations based off those two different types of samples.
Did you prepare any reports pertaining to your work in this case?
I did.
If I may approach the witness, Your Honor.
You may.
Handing you has been marked as Peoples 88. You can just take a look at that. Do you recognize what I've handed you?
I do. This is the record number 17, which is our internal identification numbers that is authored by myself in regards to evidence pertaining to this case.
And what's the date on that report?
The date that this report was completed is dated April 8th, 2019.
Okay. And you mentioned that your lab uses this PCR test, which is, you said, the gold standard, correct?
Correct.
Is that the same technology you use then?
Correct. This particular report would represent the results of that screening
Okay.
to determine what's eligible to do the DNA analysis on.
Can you explain that screening process?
Sure. So the attempt of that screening process, sometimes called body fluid identification or sometimes called serology, that is where we would take the bulk evidence or the items received to us that were recovered or collected from a crime scene, and we would examine those items to find anything that might be eligible for DNA analysis that could provide information for that case. So we might look for biological materials such as blood, semen, seminal fluid, saliva, or shed skin cells. on different pieces of evidence. Once we examine that, if we're able to identify something suitable for DNA, we would isolate a portion of that or a suitable amount that we could attempt to do that DNA analysis that I've described to you. So this report, or this record number 17, is a summary of the screening results for evidence I received on this case.
Can you go through what that evidence that you received was?
Yes, would you like me to just go through the list that is in the evidence received section of this report?
If that's okay with counsel and with the court, if she could,
That's fine.
thank you, she could consult the report.
Okay. So one of the sections of my summary or my report is just stating the evidence that I received for this particular case. The laboratory number that I'm referencing is 32386-83. And I received, each item that I received would be identified with that particular laboratory number. So the 32386-83, and then an additional identifier with that laboratory number to identify the item within that case. That's how we give each item a unique association to a particular case. So I will list each of the item numbers so that I'm not repeating the lab number every time for brevity. But item 15A was identified as item number 25, blood type stains on the label of a spray bottle. Item 15B was a wax tray identified as item 25-A, one labeled with blood stain. Item 15C, 8 slides identified as 25-B. 15D, 3 slides identified as A, B, and C from Dr. Grazer. Container number 16 was a sealed evidence envelope identified as 2 buccal swabs from Gordon Atwood.
What is a buccal swab, by the way?
A buccal swab is a collection of the cells from the inside of an individual's cheek. So I mentioned earlier that we would compare evidence samples or unknowns to known reference samples. Those buccal swabs are our most common type of known reference sample. So we take that from a known identity, we know the source of that DNA.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Container number 17 was 1 sealed evidence envelope identified as 2 buccal swabs from Karen Atwood. Container 18 is 1 sealed heat plastic evidence bag identified as blood samples from Gordon and Karen Atwood. Item 19A was red-brown stains from an air scoop, L-1. 19B was a stained area on the top center area of the trunk, L-2. 19C, red-brown crust on the bottom surface of air scoop in the middle, L-3. 19D, red-brown stained carpet on the driver's side rear floor, L-4. 19E, red-brown crust from the driver's side under the seat, L-5. 19F, red-brown crust from the back of the driver's seat, L-6. Container 20 is 1 heat-sealed plastic evidence bag identified as items L-6 to L-9 soil samples from the vehicle. Item 21-A was 5 extract tubes in heat-sealed packaging. Container number 22, 1 sealed evidence envelope, 62-4216-18, number 7, identified as DNA extracts, L5, 25A, 25B, 34, 36, and 37. Item 23 is 1 extraction tube from a biopsy smear from Richard Atwood. Item 24 is a biopsy slide from item number 34. Number 25 is Karen Atwood buccal swabs. Number 26 is Gordon Atwood buccal swabs.
Now, you mentioned that you have to go through a screening process. What was your screening process for these items?
So each evidence might be screened slightly differently based on what we see and what's observed when we do the general documentation of the item. So to start that screening process, documentation and description of the item would be the initial step. Depending on what's seen and what information is available, that's what would guide the analyst in determining what we would screen for. Sometimes that's just cellular material that might have been shed or left on the item. Sometimes we see a biological stain, such as a red-brown discoloration that we would screen for. It really depends on the item of evidence. I can go through each item and describe for you my conclusions for what was screened, if that's how you'd like me to proceed.
Were some of the items discarded, or not discarded, but not screened for any reason?
Correct. So the list of evidence that I just described would be everything that I received or took into my custody when I started the analysis of this case. That doesn't necessarily mean that I would open every single container and screen every single item depending on what was requested from the investigating agency. So some of those items were not examined and would not have been screened and sent forward for DNA.
So yes, going back to what you had asked before, could you go through and explain your screening process for those items?
Sure. So item number 15A, that was item number 25, blood stains on the label of a spray bottle. That particular piece of evidence had a portion that was removed for subsequent DNA testing. So based on what I observed, a sample was collected that was sent forward in that small 2-inch plastic tube that I sent forward for DNA analysis. So that would have subsequent DNA results with it. Item 15B, wax tray, identified as 25-A, one label with bloodstain. This item was not analyzed and was returned to the agency.
Why was that?
Because there was not biological material that was suitable on that we sent forward, or in some cases, we had an alternate sample that had a better chance of yielding DNA results.
In this case, the court has already heard testimony on that alternate sample. That alternate sample was what?
The alternate sample was from the label on the spray bottle.
And that's the kinship analysis with comparing that sample to Karen and Gordon Sr.?
Correct. So that resulting DNA profile was compared to biological relatives.
Okay.
Parents.
Thank you. If you could please continue.
Item 15C, this was 8 slides, identified as 25-B. This item was not analyzed and was returned to the investigating agency. Item 15D was additional slides identified as A, B, and C from Dr. Frazier. This item was not analyzed and was returned to the agency.
Just to interrupt you, a slide is what?
A slide is a piece of glass that's approximately 3 inches by 1 inch in size. And that's used in laboratories for many different scientific applications, but you can then view those samples under a microscope. So that would be used for microscopic analysis or examination of a sample. You could look at the type of cellular material. If they're, sometimes in our laboratory, we'll use a slide to search for sperm cells, for example, in a sample. So the slide is used for microscopic examination.
Thank you.
Item number 19A was a red-brown stain from the air scoop, L-1. This screening resulted in a hemostic positive result.
What is a hemostic positive result?
A hemostic is a screening tool that we use in the laboratory to indicate if blood could be present or not. So it is often used in testing if there's blood in urine. And this is just a small stick that in the presence of blood would turn a tealish blue-green color if there could be blood indicated on the sample. We just use this to screen because there's a lot of different things, as you could imagine, that look red-brown stained in nature. So this just helps to guide us if this is possibly a blood stain or not. So based on that result, it did indicate the possible presence of blood on that sample, and a portion of that stain was removed for the subsequent DNA testing that would be in a separate DNA report. Item 19B was a stained area on the top center area of the trunk. This item was not analyzed and was available for return to the agency. 19C was a red-brown crust on the bottom surface of the air scoop in the middle L-3. This was also hemostatic positive or indicated the possible presence of blood. A portion or swab of this was removed for subsequent DNA testing. Item 19D was identified as a red-brown stained carpet on the driver's side rear floor, L-4. This particular sample was phenolphthalein positive.
What is that?
This is also a screening test for blood. Phenolphthalein is another color change. We use a lot of color change tests in the laboratory to guide us whether something could be a possible biological fluid or not. Phenolphthalein is just another type of screening test for whether blood could be indicated or not. This particular sample did indicate the possible presence of blood and was phenolphthalein positive, and a swab was taken of this item for subsequent DNA testing. Item 19E, it is a red-brown cross from the driver's side under the seat. This was also hemostatic positive and indicated the possible presence of blood, and a portion of that sample was removed for subsequent DNA analysis. 19F was a red-brown cross from the back of the driver's seat, L-6. This sample was also hemostatic positive and indicated the possible presence of blood. A portion of that sample was removed for subsequent DNA analysis as well. Item 21A was 5 extract tubes in heat-sealed packaging. These samples were previously extracted DNA items that were retained when that initial DNA testing was done for subsequent testing, and because we were doing new testing, these samples were not analyzed as part of this record, so they would be referenced back to a previous DNA record from prior years. To give a little more background on that, if that's appropriate.
Yeah, yes, please explain.
So DNA technology changes over time. We are able to do more with less, and it's more sensitive. So in this particular situation, these samples were extracts that were outsourced to a private vendor years prior. And my analysis was updated testing that was more sensitive and more current technology of samples pertaining to this case. Item number 23 is an extraction tube of a biopsy smear from Rick Atwood. This item was retained for subsequent DNA testing. Item number 24 is a biopsy slide. Again, that glass microscopic smear or slide. This item was not analyzed and is available for return. Item number 25 was Karen Atwood buccal swabs, or the insides of those cheek cells. A portion was removed for subsequent DNA analysis from that sample. Item 26 was Gordon Atwood's buccal swabs. A portion of this was removed for subsequent DNA testing. And items within the following containers were not analyzed and were returned to the agency, and that would be containers 16, 17, 18, 20, and 22.
All right, thank you. I may approach again.
May.
It's been marked as People's 89. Do you recognize what I've just handed you?
I do. This is representative of my record number 18 related to this case under laboratory number 32386-83. And this is the DNA analysis from the samples that I just described in the previous record as far as the screening results of what went on for DNA testing.
And you authored that report?
I did.
What is the date on that report?
The date completed on this report is June 17th, 2019.
Your Honor, I would move for admission of what's been marked as People's 89.
And I don't think, did you ask for admission of 88 in that? I don't think you did.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I did. If I didn't, I would move for the admission of both, please.
Thank you. Ms.
No objection.
Court would admit exhibit 88 and 89.
As for 89, may I also publish that to the jury?
You may.
So you just said that record that People's 89 is the record of your DNA analysis. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And I asked you this before as to the last report, and you corrected me. This report is done using a specific technology, the DNA analysis?
That would be done using the PCR STR testing that I described earlier.
Could you address item number 19AD? What was this specifically?
Item number 19AD was a blood stain from the driver's side rear floor, identified as L-4.
So this is something that you, in your previous report, you screened for blood,
Correct.
and then you underwent a DNA analysis on this.
Correct.
Okay. Before we get into the specifics here, an earlier witness from 1983 conducted some blood typing analysis. Did you do any blood typing on these pieces of evidence?
I did not. That type of testing is obsolete today in the laboratory. Doesn't mean that it wasn't relevant at that time. We just have better technology and resources available that give us more accurate information, or more information. I shouldn't say accurate. It wasn't incorrect information at that time, but we have more information and more specific testing today, which is why some of these same samples were processed again.
So you would do DNA today where you might do blood typing in 1983?
Correct. DNA analysis didn't exist in 1983 for the applications of forensic science.
Okay, thank you. Now getting into items 19AD and 19AE, can you explain what you did with those items?
Yes, so 19AD was that sample that was collected for DNA analysis from the bulk evidence that I received. It would have been in that small 2-inch plastic tube. I would have went through the DNA analysis of it and made my interpretations. And that's what would have been reported in this particular exhibit number 89 or record 18. The DNA results for that analysis. So I should further clarify that when I look at a DNA profile and make an interpretation, my first step is to determine if that sample is suitable for further comparisons. I would look at that sample, I would make interpretations, I would evaluate the number of contributors that are evident in that data and what I see. Once that sample is interpreted, then I would make comparisons to any of those known reference samples that I would have, such as the buccal swabs that were described and collected for DNA analysis in my previous report. So that's how that DNA interpretation process would work. And then the results of it would be reported in this record number 18. So for this particular sample, a partial DNA profile was obtained from item number 19AE. And in this, you see the full laboratory number. I'm just going to reference the item number at the end of it. They're all related to the same 32386-83. That's representative of that laboratory number that identifies it to the particular case in the laboratory. But 19AE is the blood stain from the air scoop. The partial DNA profile from 19AE matches the partial DNA profile from 15AE, which is the Richard Atwood alternate reference sample. That reference sample would have been described to you by my colleague, Mr. Schultze, in the testimony prior to mine.
And what comparisons were you able to make with this item?
The item was compared, so the first comparison was that it matched the alternate reference sample from Richard Atwood, and that would have an associated statistic. So in the DNA world, we're obligated, if we're making any sort of association, to provide a weight to that association. So that's where you would see the statistic number 1, which is represented, that statistic is presented as a rarity in the population. We call that a random match. So using the available population data, the probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random from the population having a DNA profile that matched the partial DNA profile from 19AE, which is that blood stain from the air scoop, is 1 in 47.85 billion for the Caucasian population database, 1 in 6.789 trillion for the African American database, and 1 in 179.1 billion for the Hispanic population database.
Why do you compare those specific groups?
Those are the three population groups that by policy and procedure, we report all of those because it's a very representative, it covers the most representative population that we would be encountering in our casework. It's not specific to every very small heritage, but in the United States, we have a lot of mixed heritages, and these population groups cover a general range of those population groups.
Why would the figures be different for Caucasians, African Americans, Hispanic people?
So within the DNA analysis, we look at different locations in the profile. And in that DNA profile that we interpret, we have DNA types that each individual would have. And that's what is unique or gives us that unique DNA profile for an individual. The types have different rarities, or maybe more rare or more common in different population groups. And this mathematical statistic calculates how rare those types are in the population. So depending on the types that are obtained within the profile, we see slight differences in the numbers of the populations, just based on how rare those DNA types were in the profile of the evidence sample and how rare they are in those particular population groups.
So if Richard Atwood was a Caucasian person, this result would be typical because he's more likely to match other Caucasian people. Or that sample was, correct? Does that make sense? Do you need me to rephrase that?
Yes, please.
So the random match odds are the best in the Caucasian population, and that would be consistent if Richard Atwood were Caucasian.
The most rare is the trillions.
Well, billion is a smaller number than a trillion, right?
Correct.
Okay. So
the larger that number gets, so the largest number in this particular list is 6.789 trillion, the more rare it is in the population.
right. So it's less rare among other Caucasians, which is what your statistic shows, correct?
That would be fair.
Okay.
That number is lower
Right.
in the Caucasian population database.
Now to go back to your actual results and comparisons, what did those show?
So the blood stain from the air scoop matched the partial DNA profile with the statistic I just presented. The following items or reference samples were excluded as partial donors to this DNA profile. Karen Atwood, Gordon Atwood, Roy Snell, Gordon Atwood, and Kurt Atwood. And just to clarify in this, 26DA would represent Gordon Atwood Sr. throughout all of these reports. So when you see 26, that's representative of the buccal swab, Mr. Atwood Sr. 12AX is Gordon Atwood Jr. So throughout that, those were identified to me with date of birth when the samples were submitted. And that's how I was able to separately identify those. And Mr. Schultze would have had that same information when that paternity analysis was done.
Okay, so your analysis shows that this blood stain from the air scoop matches the alternative sample that Mr. Schultze provided.
Correct.
Right. And why did you exclude those people, those specific people?
Because the DNA types were not in common. So when I talked about that interpretation process, I make that interpretation, I determine how many donors are contributing to the sample, and I determine if the profile is suitable for further comparisons. This profile was suitable. It was compared to all of these reference samples from these known individuals, and the DNA profile that I obtained matched the types from that alternate reference from Richard Atwood. The remaining reference samples from Karen Atwood, Gordon Atwood, Roy Snell, Gordon Atwood Jr., and Kurt Atwood were excluded. So they're not the donor of that DNA sample. Their DNA types were not in common when I compared profiles.
Thank you. And just to give us an idea of what those numbers look like, the statistical odds that you explained, that's a billion and that's a trillion?
Correct.
And I know that this is a random match sample, but so we can wrap our heads around it, there are about 7.8 billion people in the world today, roughly.
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, could you talk about items CD and CE. First of all, why do you have this CD above CE? They look like the same thing?
They are the same thing, essentially. So this initial screening report, the item would have been 19C. When you see the small d, that is meaning that derivative evidence or a sample from the initial bulk evidence was collected for DNA. So that identifies the DNA sample from the bulk evidence for the DNA analyst. So you'll see the little d on many of these examples that will be shown. The small e means the DNA extract. So I described that multi-step process going through the chemical process of DNA analysis and how we develop that ending profile. The E represents that final extracted DNA sample. So that's the ending product from that. They're just this, they come from the same originating bulk source or crime scene sample. This is just how we identify the results throughout the process.
And does this reflect your result from your report?
Yes.
Okay. And can you explain that?
19CE, or the blood stain from the bottom surface of the air scoop. A partial DNA profile was obtained that's consistent with a male contributor. The partial DNA profile from 19CE matches the partial DNA profile from Richard Atwood's alternate reference sample, and this would have an associated statistic. Using the available population frequency, the probability of selecting an unrelated individual from the population at random, matching the DNA profile from 19CE is 1 in 19.41 billion for the Caucasian database, 1 in 786.8 billion for the African American database, and 1 in 83.33 billion for the Hispanic database. And the remaining reference samples from Karen, Gordon Atwood Sr., Roy Snell, Gordon Atwood Jr., and Kurt Atwood were excluded as being possible donors to this DNA profile.
Did you also test item 19D?
Yes.
And can you explain what your results were here?
19DE is the blood stain from the driver's side rear floor. A partial DNA profile was obtained from this sample that's consistent with a male contributor. An additional peak was obtained indicating an additional donor or artifact.
What does that mean?
That is a standard statement that was used in reporting at this time that this report was authored. That would indicate that I saw an additional peak in this DNA profile, but that I can't confirm that that is a real DNA peak or if it's an artifact. When I say artifact, that chemical process that I described, based on training and experience and information that we have within our protocols, I'm trained to identify if we see these artifacts in the profile. The artifacts happen just as a natural part of this DNA process. I expect to see them, and they may or may not represent a real DNA peak. So we use this statement to disclose that I saw this additional peak. Based on training and expertise, I believe this to be an artifact, but with a conservative approach, I disclose that I saw this and this one additional peak is there. So you may see this in other results within this DNA report. I expect to see those. I am interpreting them as such, but I consider that in my overall interpretation when I see these and I make a determination of the number of contributors in the sample.
So you don't list more than one contributor in this sample?
I do not.
And
so in this particular sample, I saw this one additional peak. So when I look at this profile and I make an interpretation based on my training and experience, I'm interpreting this as one donor contributing to this sample. If that additional peak were to not be an artifact, often I'm asked if that changes my interpretation, if that changes the comparison. It wouldn't change whether I would include or exclude these donors to the sample. So we disclose it because we want to be transparent and acknowledge that that's there because that's an interpretation that I make as the expert or the analyst on this case, but it wouldn't change my statistic or my interpretation of what is presented in the remaining results.
So your interpretation of this is that there is one person that contributed this blood stain.
Correct.
And this is, again, the blood stain from the driver's side rear floor?
Correct.
Okay. And what were your results here?
So this resulting DNA profile, partial DNA profile was consistent with the male contributor. This partial DNA,
Do you want, there, sorry.
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 this partial DNA profile matched the partial profile obtained from the alternate reference sample from Richard Atwood. The remaining reference samples from Karen Atwood, Gordon Atwood Sr., Roy Snell, Gordon Atwood Jr., and Kurt Atwood are excluded as possible donors to this DNA profile.
And there's an associated statistic with your match?
There is. The probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random from the population that has a DNA profile that matches this evidence sample is 1 in 57.27 trillion for the Caucasian database, 1 in 14.08 quadrillion for the African American database, and 1 in 358.2 trillion for the Hispanic population database.
Just to get a sense of those numbers, trillion is 12 zeros and a quadrillion is 15?
Correct.
And is that what you would expect to see with a match like this?
I don't have an expectation of the numbers that are generated because it's based on that rarity in the population. So I can have based on the amount of data I have in a DNA profile, I might have a general idea of it, whether I have enough information to provide a good statistic or not, but I don't really have an expectation. It differs based on each evidence profile and what data I have in the sample.
You just report the numbers.
Correct.
Did you also analyze item E, 19E?
I did. 19E was identified as a blood stain from under the driver's seat, L-5.
And what were your results here?
The DNA profile obtained from 19E, the blood stain from under the driver's seat is consistent with a male contributor. This DNA profile obtained from 19E matches the partial DNA profile from Richard Atwood, the alternate reference sample, and that has an associated statistic as well. And the remaining reference samples in this case that were compared from Karen Atwood, Gordon Atwood Sr., Roy Snell, Gordon Atwood Jr., and Kurt Atwood were excluded as possible donors to this evidence sample.
Does this reflect your associated statistic?
Yes, so the probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random that matches the evidence sample for 19E is 1 in 86.36 quintillion for the Caucasian population database, 1 in 79.37 sextillion for the African American database, and 1 in 120.8 quintillion for the Hispanic database.
And just to wrap our heads around these numbers, do those reflect what a quadrillion and a quintillion are?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, counting zero.
Right. A million millions for a billion billions for a quintillion. Is that right? Okay. So next one, did you also analyze a stain from the back side of that driver's seat?
Yes, I did. That was identified as 19F. The DNA profile obtained from 19F, or the blood stain from the back of the driver's seat, is consistent with a male contributor. Again, you see this one additional peak statement that I referenced a few minutes ago, obtained indicating an additional donor or artifact. The DNA profile obtained from 19F matches the partial DNA profile from Richard Atwood's alternate reference sample. And the remaining reference samples are excluded as possible donors to this DNA profile. So 19F, the reference sample from Karen Atwood, Gordon Atwood Sr., Roy Snell, Gordon Atwood Jr., and Kurt Atwood are excluded as possible donors to the DNA profile obtained from the blood stain in the back of the driver's seat.
And according to your analysis, this additional donor or artifact Was your conclusion the same as the previous one, that this was just a peak that shows up typically in your data?
Correct. I still interpreted this as having originated from one donor.
Is this your associated statistic?
Yes, the probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random, having a DNA profile matching that from the blood stain on the back of the driver's seat, 19F, is 1 in 86.36 quintillion for the population or the Caucasian population database, 1 in 79.37 sextillion for the African American database, and 1 in 120.8 quintillion for the Hispanic population database.
And these are those numbers that you referenced, is that right? Counting zeros.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. You also analyzed some cigarette butts, is that correct?
Yes.
Brandon, if I could just break here for a second and
Okay.
get this marked. Sorry. I may approach the witness again.
You may.
Do you recognize the package that I've just handed you?
This package has the identifying laboratory number for this case, 32386-83. It's identified as container 3, and it has our standard labeling identifying stickers that tell us the information for the case when it's submitted to the laboratory. And I can see here the DNA extract identifiers or the DNA sample identifiers for the items of the cigarette butts that are contained within this container.
And this container has 6 cigarette butts and your list from your report has 7, is that right?
Correct.
And which one's missing?
8BX is not within this container.
Thank you very much. Your Honor, may I publish this to the jury?
I haven't seen
All
it.
right. I haven't translated it.
That's fine. I just wanted to report it to the show.
What number is that?
90, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Move to admit what's been marked as People's 90, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Court would admit People's 90. You may publish it.
Thank you. I'd like to start with the one that's not in the package. This is, or I actually want to start with 8A1X if possible. Did you conduct an analysis of that?
Yes.
What did your analysis reveal?
A partial DNA profile was obtained from that particular cigarette butt, 8A1X, that's consistent with an unknown male contributor. 2 additional peaks were detected indicating an initial donor or artifact. And the following items were excluded as possible donors to the partial DNA profile obtained from the cigarette butt.
This is a different result than the ones we've discussed previously. How is this different?
This is different because in the previous results, I made an association, or I had a reference sample that had common DNA types and provided a statistic with that associated weight of that comparison. In this result, the 6 reference samples that I have for this case are all excluded. So essentially, this is an unidentified male contributor that I didn't make an association to any of these reference samples.
I'd like to talk about 8A2X, please. Were you able to make an association with this?
Yes, so this was a partial DNA profile that was consistent with a male contributor. An additional peak was detected indicating an additional donor or artifact. The partial DNA profile obtained from the cigarette butt 8A2X matches the DNA profile from Roy Snell. And this has an associated statistic because I'm making an association. Karen Atwood, Gordon Atwood Sr., Gordon Atwood Jr., Kurt Atwood, and Richard Atwood alternate reference are excluded as possible donors to the DNA profile obtained from this cigarette butt.
So when you're comparing it to Roy Snell, you're not comparing it to an alternative sample. You had a direct buccal swab from Roy Snell.
Correct.
And was there an associated statistic with that match?
There was. The probability of selecting an unrelated individual that has a DNA profile matching that from 8A2X cigarette butt is 1 in 2.879 sextillion for the Caucasian database, 1 in 63.61 quintillion for the African American database, and 1 in 421.4 quintillion for the Hispanic database.
And item 8A3X, was this another one of the cigarette butts you tested?
It was. The partial DNA profile obtained from this cigarette butt is consistent with a male contributor. Partial DNA profile from 8A3X matches the DNA profile from Roy Snell and has an associated statistic. And the remaining reference samples from Karen Atwood, Gordon Atwood Sr., Gordon Atwood Jr., Kurt Atwood, and Richard Atwood's alternate reference are excluded as possible donors to this evidence profile.
And is this your associated statistic?
Yes, the probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random, having a DNA profile that matches that of item 8A3X cigarette butt is 1 in 19.18 quintillion, 1 in 310.8 quadrillion, and 1 in 2.289 quintillion.
Now, before we were talking about testing blood stains. Here you're testing a cigarette butt. How do you go about testing a cigarette butt? Is that different?
The screening process could be different, but typically with a cigarette butt, we have an expectation that that cigarette butt has been in someone's mouth in order to use that cigarette butt as it would be used. So in the absence of seeing visible staining on that cigarette butt, we would just cut the filtered end of that and put a portion of that paper in that extraction tube, and that's what would be processed. Alternately, we could take a swab. We often use sterile cotton tip swabs. We could swab the end of that, trying to pick up the site of the material or the saliva remaining on that. But because paper is an absorbent material, typically we would cut a portion of the end of that cigarette butt and put that in the tube to extract it. Attempt to pull those cells or that DNA off the end of the cigarette butt.
Did you do the same for item 8A4X?
Yes, a partial DNA profile was obtained from 8A4X, which is also identified as a cigarette butt. It is consistent with a male contributor. An additional peak was detected, indicating an additional donor artifact. And this partial DNA profile matched the DNA profile from Roy Snell. The remaining reference samples from Karen Atwood, Gordon Atwood Sr., Gordon Atwood Jr., Kurt Atwood, and Richard Atwood's alternate reference were excluded as donors to this evidence profile.
And what was your associated statistic?
The probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random, having a DNA profile that matches the cigarette butt from 8A4X is 1 in 348.3 quintillion, 1 in 5.875 quintillion, and 1 in 48.8 quintillion, for the associated Caucasian, Hispanic, and African American databases.
And for 8A5X?
The partial DNA types obtained from 8A5X are consistent with a mixture of 2 donors, indicating or including a major male contributor. The minor donor to this item is insufficient for conclusive association purposes. And this is a slightly different result from those that have been presented prior. The prior DNA interpretations have been single contributors. When I did that initial interpretation that I described of the data, I interpreted those samples as originating from a single donor. This sample is different in nature because I can tell that it's a mixture of more than one contributor. So this goes back to basic genetic principles that you inherit half of your DNA from your mother and half of your DNA from your father. That combination gives an individual their unique DNA profile. And when we make the interpretations, we can look at that profile and based on what we see, interpret if more than one donor is contributing. In this case, that interpretation indicated more than one donor, and I interpreted this as 2 donors. When we look at the profile, sometimes, not always, we can look at it and see that one contributor is in that profile in a higher proportion than others. When that happens, we would look and call that a major contributor. And the remaining portion of the mixture would be the minor contributor or contributors. So in this sample, I had a major male contributor that I could see in a higher proportion of this sample. That contributor, I had enough information that I could make comparisons to it. That minor contributor, I can see that they're there. I can see that there's DNA types, but to make an association and feel confident that I'm making those comparisons and have enough information, I have to have a certain amount of information. In this case, that minor contributor was not enough information. So the minor contributor, there are 2 donors in this sample, but the comparisons reported here are only to that major contributor because the minor contributor was a very small amount.
So I'm not asking you to speculate, but an example for a cigarette butt could be someone was smoking it and their friend took 1 puff of it and then gave it back. Could that result in something like this?
I can't really speak to the activity of how the DNA gets there. So what I can say is when I see more than one contributor, there's indication that somehow there's some sort of activity or some sort of handling of this item where someone else's DNA is on the item. My role as the DNA analyst in doing the interpretations isn't to speak to the activity of how that DNA gets there. I look at the evidence, I interpret the evidence, and I make comparisons to it. So I can't say, I can give examples of how DNA could get there, but I can't conclusively tell you how the DNA was placed there.
Just that there's 2 donors here.
Correct. I can see evidence of more than one contributor, and I can see that a male contributor is in this profile in a higher proportion of this major male donor.
Who's the major male donor matching to in this case?
The major contributor from 8A5X cigarette butt matches the DNA profile from Roy Snell. And an associated statistic is provided. And the following reference samples from Karen Atwood, Gordon Atwood Sr., Gordon Atwood Jr., Kurt Atwood, and Richard Atwood's alternate reference sample are excluded as a possible donor to the major contributor. The associated statistic to that major contributor is the probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random from the population having a DNA profile that matches the major contributor to 8A5X is 1 in 12.92 trillion for the Caucasian database, 1 in 814.3 billion for the African American database, and 1 in 3.625 trillion for the Hispanic database.
Did you do the same for cigarette butt marked 8A6X?
Correct. My interpretation of item 8A6X is that a partial DNA profile is obtained that's consistent with a male contributor. So again, this goes back to a single source or one contributor to the sample. The partial DNA profile from this cigarette butt matches the DNA profile from Roy Snell, has an associated statistic, and the remaining reference samples from Karen Atwood, Gordon Atwood Sr., Gordon Atwood Jr., Kurt Atwood, and Richard Atwood's alternate reference sample. Those references are excluded as being a possible donor to the DNA profile team from this cigarette butt.
You had an associated statistic?
The probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random from the population having a DNA profile that matches item 8A6X from the cigarette butt is 1 in 4.836 quintillion for the Caucasian database, 1 in 161.3 quadrillion for the African American database, and 1 in 526 quadrillion for the Hispanic database.
And for item 8BX?
The partial DNA types obtained from HBX cigarette butt are consistent with a mixture of 2 donors, including a major male contributor. The minor donor to this item is insufficient for conclusive association purposes.
What does that mean?
That means that I didn't have enough information from that second contributor. I believe there to be 2 contributors to this sample. I can see that from the data, but that minor contributor is in such a small amount or a small proportion that I don't have enough information in the profile to make comparisons.
As for the major donor, did that match any of the samples?
The major contributor from HBX matches the DNA profile from Roy Snell. The remaining reference samples from this case are excluded as possible donors to the major DNA types. So Karen Atwood, Gordon Atwood Sr., Gordon Atwood Jr., Kurt Atwood, and Richard Atwood's alternate reference sample are excluded from the major donor of this profile.
And your associated statistic?
The probability of selecting an unrelated individual at random from the population, having a DNA profile that matches this major contributor for the cigarette butt, HBX, is 1 in 11.07 million for the Caucasian database, 1 in 297.4 thousand for the African American database, and 1 in 1.853 million for the Hispanic database.
So you analyzed 7 total cigarettes and 6 of them you associated with a match to Roy Snell, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. That is reflected in the item that you already examined for cigarettes as People's 90. These are the cigarettes that matched?
Correct.
Thank you. Now, we've been talking about this alternative sample, and you, what was your association with obtaining data for that alternative sample? Alternative profile, I'm sorry, alternative profile for Rick Atwood. I'm referring specifically to item 15AE.
So 15AE, this was the sample that was from the red-brown stain of the spray bottle. So a partial DNA profile was obtained from 15AE that was consistent with a male contributor. 1 additional peak was obtained indicating an additional donor or artifact. And then the following items are excluded as a possible donor to the DNA profile obtained from item 15AE. I excluded Karen Atwood, Gordon Atwood Sr., Roy Snell, Gordon Atwood Jr., and Kurt Atwood from the DNA profile under my record number 18. Using the information from Mr. Schulze's paternity analysis, that was what determined item 15AE to be used as an alternate reference. And essentially, the other biological relatives from this family were ruled out. And that's how we came to use this as an alternate reference. An alternate reference is part of our procedures and part of our policies that in different case situations when we don't have a reference sample for an individual, we will use these alternate approaches to provide a reference sample to make these comparisons. It could be something very intimate to an individual, such as a toothbrush or items that are known to have only been used by an individual that we could use as an alternate reference. In this case, we took the approach of very specific biological relatives within a family to, by process of elimination, determine what that alternate reference sample would be.
Now, in this item, again, you found that additional peak. So on that, your analysis, can you analyze animal DNA?
We don't analyze animal DNA. There are certainly DNA processes that can analyze DNA. Different universities and research centers can do that type of analysis. The chemistry that I use, that PCR, SPR technology described, is specific to human DNA. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't pick up an artifact from something like bacteria or non-human DNA in it. And that goes right back to that possible artifact or whether that's a real DNA peak or not from a human source. But our particular chemistry is specific to human DNA.
So, but you are trained in recognizing what's an artifact and what would be a contributor from, say, an animal.
We are trained to identify those artifacts, correct?
And in this case, this evidence from the spray bottle, you concluded that that was an artifact?
Correct.
And how do you make that determination?
Based on what that peak looks like, where it's located in the profile, general training, and analyzing thousands and thousands of DNA samples in my career, we just see these artifacts and where they will typically show up in the data. There are certain criteria that we're looking for, so we're not just making this criteria up as we go, but the chemistry is expected to produce some of these based on the data that we have, that we see, and I'm trained to identify that.
So for item 15AE, this red-brown stain from the spray bottle, you concluded that this is a match to your alternatives, a match to what you determined as the DNA profile of Richard Atwood.
I didn't make a match to that.
That was Mr. Schultze.
That Mr. Schultze made a comparison to the parents to determine paternity. So he made a comparison. It's a different approach because a match is an unknown profile to a known profile and comparing those DNA types and providing a statistic to go with it. Mr. Schultze's is a different approach because you're using the known DNA profiles from relatives and parents, going back to that inheritance model of half from mom and half from dad to make the comparisons and determine paternity.
And an animal wouldn't show paternity results that would allow you to say that Gordon Atwood Sr. and Karen Atwood were the parents of an animal.
I wouldn't expect to have an interpretable DNA profile if the source of this biological stain was from an animal. I might see peaks in my data in that picture or that profile, but it wouldn't be of an interpretable state.
Okay. And in this case, only an artifact, is that right?
One additional peak.
And you determined that to be an artifact?
I did.
Okay, thank you. I have no more questions at this time, Your Honor.
Now would probably be a good time for a recess. It's about 10:30. Everybody's been sitting a while. So we'll stand in recess till about 10:45, quarter to 11. You want to go ahead and take the jury out? We can do that. Stan, you're still sworn in, and I think we're turning to Ms. Smulders or Ms. Smulders. You may go ahead, Ms. Smulders.
Hi there, how are you?
Good.
Good. My name is Valerie Smulders. I represent the defendant here along with Ms. Korndike, okay? And I'm just gonna ask you some follow-up questions. And I can't remember if it was you or the gentleman before you, but I was appreciative of counsel saying that they might be stupid questions because a lot of it is a bit complicated and obviously not my expertise. But I wanna start with the samples that you were given. And maybe just breaking down to the cigarette butts itself. I know you testified to 7, correct? Were you given more than 7 and you just chose to put the 7 in your report, or were you only given the 7?
Oh, could I have copies of those reports?
Okay.
Or I have a copy that I could reference.
Okay, I have
As well.
copies. But I possibly
Did it look at 88 and 89?
87, 88, and 89. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
So in my record number 18, which was the DNA analysis record, it references in that evidence section, which lists everything that I would have received for DNA analysis. that the items were previously analyzed under record 9.
Okay,
So I would need to reference the case file for record 9 to ensure that all 7, that there weren't more than 7 cigarette butts, to be 100% confident that all of the cigarette butts were forwarded for DNA analysis.
okay, so off the top of your head, you're unsure, correct?
Yeah, there's too much information on this case. I don't want to misspeak that there were
Understood.
all of them. And I do have a copy of that if you would like me to reference it, but
Do you have that on your person right now?
I do.
Okay, yes, if you would, please.
Okay. So record number 9, that's referenced in the evidence section of exhibit number 89, lists the 7 cigarette butt samples that I did, that the DNA had DNA comparisons to. Record number 9 is the initial DNA analysis report, and that lists 7 cigarette butt samples that were forwarded for DNA analysis initially. That report was authored by myself, so I did do that, but I did not cut or receive the initial DNA or the bulk cigarette samples. Those would be, because it's that 2-step process, so we've got a screening and then a DNA. So record number 9 represents the initial DNA analysis of it. So that would have been the same interpretations that I read earlier, just this report makes the comparisons to those additional reference samples
Okay,
in it. So the cigarette butts would have been cut and prepared under a screening report, which would have been under record number 8. So
and you
these,
have record number 8.
and I have record number 8 to reference as well. This record was authored by a colleague, but the sample was just, there was no testing, it was just the cigarette butts were cut.
Okay,
And so the inventory or the evidence section of that record lists 8A and 8B from record number 8, and just lists cigarette butts from the ashtray and cigarette butts from item number 4. And that portions were removed for subsequent DNA testing. So those were samples turned over to me for DNA analysis that were prepared by a different examiner.
okay. Then in that record number 8, does it reference, well, strike that. I understand then you were, what was turned over to you were the 7, correct? Am I saying that correctly?
Yes, 7 cigarette butt samples were turned over to me. Now I can see from notes, from that analyst's notes, that from the first item, 6 cigarette butts were inventoried, and from the second item, 1 cigarette butt was inventoried. So from the notes in that case record, a total of 7 cigarette butts were examined under that record, and that is what I received as 7 cigarette butts.
Okay, thank you.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
for researching that too. While you have that inventory and I'm not sure if you have to refer to that or not, but for you personally, were you given anything else to analyze aside from the cigarette butts and the blood stains?
The items that I would have been given to analyze were all listed under exhibit 88 that would have been presented from items 15, A, B, C, and D, which included the slides.
Sure.
It included buccal swabs that were previously collected that I had new samples of
Okay.
that were not opened and examined. The blood stains from the vehicle, L1 to L3, L4, L5, and L6, which were 19A through F. Soil samples that were not examined,
Okay,
that would not be an applicable DNA sample. Soil samples wouldn't be something we would do for DNA analysis. Previous extract tubes, I mentioned earlier that there was previous DNA analysis and we re-examined those samples. So rather than, I didn't open those extract tubes because I took new cuttings of them to do with current technology. So those items were received, but I did not do DNA analysis with them. There was the biopsy smear, extraction tube. There was a biopsy slide, and then the associated buccal swabs were prepared for current technology.
okay. And then going back then to the cigarette butts, you were talking about 2 out of the 7 had a major and minor donor, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Is there any way to break down the percentages of what a major donor on that particular sample would be and the minor donor would be?
Not with the interpretation that was done. It would be an eyeballed percentage, just looking. So when we look at that DNA profile, we see peaks that give the picture. And those peaks have different heights. So if I have peaks at this level, just for demonstration's sake, and minor peaks at this level, then I can look the numerical height of them and do generalized estimations of them. But that wouldn't necessarily always be done, especially if you've got such low minor types that there isn't enough information to use those for interpretation.
Okay. So it's not an exact science essentially, but you kind of calculate the difference in the peaks from the major and minor. Is that
I can
summarize?
calculate percentages based on those peak heights and come up with estimated percentages.
Okay.
But for reporting purposes, if you have a major donor that is in that higher proportion, that I'm essentially pulling that major donor out as a single contributor, then we wouldn't report that percentage.
Sure. Kind of following up on that then, in your report, when you're reporting a major and a minor donor, does the minor just have to be essentially just a little bit less than the major for you to report it that way, and using percentages, just 49% or lower, and conversely, a major would be 51% or higher? Does that make sense?
Not typically.
Okay.
They would be typically more drastically proportioned. So maybe 70-30%, 20-80% as examples. If I have a minor donor that's so low that I'm saying it's insufficient for comparisons, there's typically a more extreme difference in those types. Those minor types, because our chemistry is very sensitive, we pick up minor donors and pick up very minor types. That doesn't necessarily mean that I have enough of a picture or enough of that information to make comparisons to it, because only a couple peaks on that minor contributor doesn't give me enough information to compare to the known reference samples.
Okay. Speaking of the reference samples, were you given any other reference samples other than the ones that you listed, which would have been the Atwood family and Roy Snell?
No, I don't believe so.
No. Okay. Does your DNA testing allow you to determine, for example, a cigarette, again, bear with me here, and let's say that the DNA came from smoking it, okay? Does it allow you to determine if the major donor smoked last or the minor donor smoked that last?
It does not. So
Okay.
DNA doesn't have a timestamp on it. I can't put that order on there.
Okay.
I can see, because I have a major contributor, that those types are there in more quantity or a higher percentage in that particular profile, but I can't put a timestamp or an activity to that DNA being there.
So then, would it be true to say that even though there was a major donor, it doesn't necessarily mean that was the person that used that sample last?
Not necessarily,
You can't tell.
I can't tell.
Okay, so then let's talk about some environmental factors that could possibly affect major and minor donors. And again, sorry, bear with me here, but let's say one individual was initially a major donor, and then at some point in time, that specimen was subject to whatever environmental conditions that are out there. Does that major donor then decrease due to these environmental factors, or does environmental factors have any role on the samples that you are given?
Absolutely, and by environmental factors, that could be heat, sunlight, UV radiation, moisture, bacteria, all of those could affect the quality of the DNA profile that we're able to obtain. It doesn't change DNA types. It doesn't mean that the DNA profile, it doesn't change the profile obtained, but what it might change is the amount of that profile that I'm able to detect or interpret. So I might see that there's a lot of DNA there, but in the end product not have DNA types at certain locations because the environmental factors would have degraded that. So we use the term degraded when those environmental factors come into play. So it doesn't change the DNA profile. If I have enough information to make interpretations, then I use the information that I have available. It just, instead of detecting at every single location, maybe I detect it a third of them or half of them, or maybe I lose one location.
Okay.
So we look at the chemistry and at 24 different locations on the DNA. And for example, a degraded profile, maybe I only have information at 20 out of 24 of those. So it's not a change in the profile. It's the amount of information that I might have.
Okay. So then is it possible that, and again with the cigarette sample, that sample could have a major donor, but due to environmental factors, that major donor then had changed to be a minor donor? Does that make sense?
So you're asking if that minor donor could have at one time been the major?
Correct.
It would depend on how that sample, when that DNA was put there and how it was transferred.
Okay.
So sometimes we could see them degrade at different times. Most typically, if the DNA was there at the same time, they would degrade the same way.
Sure.
We wouldn't see this flip. But again, I can't tell you how the DNA got there, and I can't tell you when it got there. So for example, if DNA was put there at one time and a year later was put there at another time by someone else, we could see those major minor differences. But if the DNA is there at the same time, exposed to the same environmental factors, I would expect them to degrade at the same rate.
Sure. So then the former example, though, if the DNA was put there at different times and due to environmental factors, it is possible that they could flip.
It's possible.
Okay.
That wouldn't necessarily be a flip.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm probably using the wrong
It's
word,
okay.
but the
It
major or
wouldn't
the minor
necessarily be a
becoming.
flip. There would just have been degraded DNA there first and new DNA put there later.
Got it. Okay.
But your wording of flip could be what that looks like
Okay.
in the profile.
Okay. And then that being said, can a person's DNA then degrade enough to completely disappear from a sample altogether due to environmental factors?
Yes, we get conditions on degraded samples that the profile is not interpretable, that at some point I don't have enough information or there's too much loss of data to make those comparisons.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So kind of switching subjects here, in regards to the alternative sample that you had for Richard Atwood. You had talked about these paternity comparisons and this alternative reference. You had stated, of course, there was no direct DNA from Richard Atwood, correct?
Correct.
In layman's terms here, not scientific terms, is it essentially just a process of elimination? So we're taking the parents and we're taking the siblings and we're taking these samples and we're eliminating that it's not none of those, correct?
That would be a fair statement, that we have eliminated all other biological children, and that remaining profile was found to be consistent with a biological child of those parents.
Okay.
And that was how we made that determination of an alternate reference.
So then with the 7 cigarette butt samples that you had, 8A3X and 8A6X were the only 2 samples that had only Roy Snell's DNA 100%, correct?
A2X matched Roy Snell.
Well, and I probably should have clarified. So I know there were some that matched, but those ones that I'm trying to exclude at this point, at least, all indicated that it had an additional peak or additional donor and or artifact. So excluding those ones, the ones that did not have any sort of additional peak, is it true that only 8A3X and 8A6X 100% matched Roy Snell?
Those are the only 2 that either were not a mixture or did not have the artifact in them.
Okay.
When you say 100% match, if I author a report statement that says somebody matches, then the interpretable DNA profile that was compared matches at those types.
Understood. But with the other ones, and I believe there are, let's see here, 2 other ones. So you're talking about 8A2X and 8A4X. Those had the additional peaks. And you testified based on your expert opinion that was just an artifact and not an additional donor, correct?
Correct. And that would also include 8A1X that had those peaks consistent with artifacts.
Okay, yes, but 8A1X did not conclude, and in fact, Roy Snell was excluded from that one, correct? Okay. And you may not know the answer to this, but the 2 that had the additional peaks, in which Roy Snell was also included, I know you're saying this is your professional opinion. Do professional opinions vary?
They could, based on training and experience.
Okay.
But the artifacts are something that's part of procedure. They're part of the scientific community is all aware of these and trained in them. So with 1 additional peak in what would be consistent with an artifactual peak, I would expect that another experienced analyst would similarly draw the same conclusion.
Sure.
But yes, could there be differences in expert opinion? That's fair.
Okay, thank you. And just to clarify, an additional donor, it actually means it could be another person's DNA, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure I'm understanding everything clear as day here. Okay, so then in terms of chain of custody, you obviously did not get these samples back in '83, correct? Okay. Are you aware of the chain of custody that these samples went through before they were given and presented to you?
I would have been aware of the chain of custody from the time it was received to the laboratory.
Okay,
So prior to that, would be questioning for someone else.
sure, okay. So then all the samples that you previously listed, then you can just attest to when it came to the lab, but nothing prior.
Correct.
Okay. And when analyzing the blood samples, and I'm not saying this purposely or intentionally at all, but would it be possible then you were actually analyzing samples that were direct samples provided from, let's say, a hospital of Richard Atwood that he attended in the past? I mean, isn't it true you just don't know that they came from the vehicle?
I use the descriptions that I have and what's described on the evidence and the items, and I'm not the one collecting them. So that would be questions for the agency. I identify them based on what description is provided to me.
Okay. And then the same for the cigarette butts. They could have, for all you know, not come directly from the car, from Roy Snell's house, for example.
I can't speak to any of that.
Okay. Maybe I can ask it this way. Are you aware of any times when samples have been mistakenly procured from a different place?
Not in my experience.
Not in your experience. Okay. Not at your facility, at least.
Correct.
Okay. All right. I'm going to confer with co-counsel for a minute. Okay.
We're all set. Thank you. Can you redirect?
Just very briefly, Your Honor. Ms. Meredith, we talked before about excluding siblings, which you did in your analysis, correct? And we touched on this with Mr. Schultze. Why would you not go to the step of excluding Annette and Lynn, his Richard Atwood sisters?
When we look at DNA profiles, we have one location. I mentioned that we have 24 different locations, and one of those locations is a sex typing marker. So I can look at the profile and tell if it's a male or a female right off the bat.
So there's no point to excluding his sisters in this analysis?
Not that it was necessary for the purposes of an alternate reference. I already knew that I was working with a male. And certainly we could have compared reference samples from a female, but that sex typing marker would have been a deciding factor.
Now going to these additional peaks again. You testified on cross-examination that the presence of these peaks doesn't mean there isn't a match. Can you explain that?
The peaks are disclosed to explain them and be transparent so that you know that I saw them in the data and factored them into my interpretation. It doesn't negate the fact that the peaks that were interpretable and are there are a match to the reference sample that is compared, or an exclusion for that matter.
And is it unusual to see one additional peak in a sample?
No, and a single peak isn't enough information we'd ever make a comparison anyways. So similarly to when I referenced the mixture samples, there was a minor contributor. I had enough peaks there that I could see that that wasn't just an artifact. I had another person contributing to that DNA sample. A single peak is not enough information that you'd ever make a comparison. So if I had a DNA profile with just a single peak, it would be reported as an insufficient DNA profile, and I'd never make comparisons to it. So similarly, with the transparency and disclosing the artifact peaks, it doesn't change the interpretation that was reported and presented.
So in this case where you just saw one additional peak in the cigarette samples taken from the car, you said experts would tend to agree if they saw the same thing that you did.
I can't conclusively say that, but these are not unique artifacts. These are not, if we're reporting these as an artifact, they have a certain trait and characteristic that would be interpreted in the DNA profile, and that's common throughout the community. That's common in our protocols and between analysts. So could somebody have a difference of opinion? Sure, they could.
You said these being common in the community, and this is a regular way of reporting that. Is that fair to say?
That's fair.
And in fact, have your reporting procedures changed recently to reflect that consensus in the community?
Yes, if this report was being authored today, the artifacts would be documented in our notes in our case file and wouldn't even be reported in the report, because these are known scientific artifacts from the manufacturers to the standard operating procedures. We train scientists on this. So today, if this report were being written, we would not even include that statement in the reports.
So in summation, you made these matches and you stand by these matches.
Yes.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Ms. Walters? Just briefly, okay? So getting back to the cigarette butts, 8A1X, Roy was excluded and it was an unknown male contributor. Were you able to extrapolate, I guess, the DNA from that cigarette? Like, do you have that DNA on file? Does that make sense?
Are you asking if I have it, if we maintain the data for that particular sample?
Yes.
Yes, all data generated would be contained within the case file for the associated laboratory member. So yes, that unknown DNA profile that wasn't associated would be maintained within that case file.
Okay. And then the same for the 2 cigarette butts that have the 2 donors, remember the major and minor? Were you able to keep then that data for those minor DNAs? Is that stored somewhere as well, that information?
Yes, all of the DNA profiles that would have been generated, both from reference samples and evidentiary samples, are maintained within the case file. In that minor, those profiles that had the minor contributors, they're in the same DNA profile. We just see the peaks at different intensities.
Sure.
So it's not a separate minor profile that's obtained or that's maintained within the case file. It's the same DNA profile because it's a mixture. We see the 2 contributors in one picture, if that clarifies.
Is there a way, or were you able to tell on the 2 cigarette butts that had the major and minor donors if both were the same? Meaning the major and minor donors on 8A5X and 8BX were the same major and minor donors?
So the major donor on 8A5X, and the other one you were referencing was BX, correct?
Correct, yep.
Yes, the major contributor on both of those cigarette butts in their evidentiary profile matched the DNA profile from Roy Snell.
Correct.
On both of those, the minor donors are of an insufficient level to compare. So there's no comparisons to reference samples on those types. So I can't tell you if they're the same minor source or not.
Okay, so the 2 you can't compare against each other.
Correct. We wouldn't do that on insufficient profiles because it's just not enough information to make an accurate comparison.
Okay. And I'm assuming I know this answer then, but I guess let's see here. So then with those 2 minor donors, there's not enough information to compare it with 8A1X either, which is that unknown.
Correct.
That's correct. Okay.
Correct.
Have you ever been asked by counsel or detectives in this case to actually test that unknown male contributor on 8A1X against anybody else's actual DNA? So Roy was excluded, Richard Atwood's family was excluded. And because there is a certain unknown male, have you ever been requested to test that against anybody?
No. Policy would say that if I have a reference sample, I'm making a comparison with any reference sample that's provided and available. So the samples that were excluded were the reference samples that I had available to me to
Okay,
make that comparison.
so not afterwards, after uncovering these findings on the AA1X, you were never asked to do anything else with that information then, correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Nothing further.
Any questions from the jury? Stay right there, she's just like reached up. Do you know where cigarette number 7 came from? I think in relation to where it was found before it came to you.
Can you clarify if number 7 is that last 8BX?
I was afraid you were gonna ask me. Number 7, I believe, is the last one you testified to, yes.
To 8, item 8BX. I would need to reference the record number 8 for that, because that report reflects the screening that was done to prepare that. So the notes from that particular cigarette butt sample are described as 1 cigarette butt in a heat sealed container labeled as removed from item number 4. And I'm just referencing those notes. The previous testimony would have to describe or give what item number 4 is from that.
All right, so you know it came from item number 4, but you don't have the police report or the reports that would tell you where item number 4 was.
I do not.
Thank you. Would the amount of the cigarette smoke, the amount of cigarette that was smoked, affect the major or minor donor? So if there was more of the cigarette left or less of the cigarette left, would that affect the minor and major donor contribution?
The smoked portion of the cigarette butt does not get tested for DNA analysis because one of those environmental factors that I described would be heat degradation. So we wouldn't target the area that would burn on the cigarette butt. We would target that filter portion of it that's left where someone's mouth would go on the cigarette butt. So whether that was just freshly lit or the whole cigarette was burnt, we see the full spectrum in typical forensic evidence come into the laboratory, and that wouldn't, how much of the cigarette was burned wouldn't make a difference in what that resulted. The transfer of biological material would be the ultimate difference of what we would see in the resulting data. So if you smoked a cigarette butt for a very brief period of time and the majority of the cigarette was left, but a significant amount of saliva was transferred to that filter, then we might see more than if very little saliva was transferred in the whole cigarette. So it's really dependent on the amount of cellular material or biological fluid that's transferred to the filter of that paper, not how much is burnt.
So these are filtered cigarettes then that you tested. They have a filter on the end versus a cigarette that does not have a filter on the end.
Very good question. Yes, from the photos that were within the case file, they are filtered cigarette butts.
And in your experience, the filter of a cigarette butt does not decrease in size based on how long or how short someone smokes it. Is that true?
Correct. That portion is that about 1 inch end of it.
Stays about the same no matter if they smoke it, the
Correct.
full cigarette or. Were the biological materials that were provided to you from 1983 degraded, or were they still strong samples?
Anything that was reported and compared, enough data was obtained from the resulting DNA profiles that I was able to make comparisons. Some of them didn't obtain data at all 24 locations, and those were reported. You might have noticed that it said the partial DNA profile. So those would have represented samples that the entire DNA profile may not have been obtained at every single location. But if there's a comparison, there was enough data there to make comparisons to the reference samples.
And you may have said this already, but can you explain it again? When you say in all 24 locations, what are you referencing?
24 locations would be the DNA chemistry that we use for processing DNA samples today. We look at 24 different spots on the DNA, and that's what the picture or profile represents, is the information from those 24 locations. One of those locations tells me the gender, it's the sex typing marker. Another one of those locations is specific to only male DNA. So we have information throughout that profile from various parts of the DNA that would be representative.
So when you're talking about the 24 locations, if you hit more of the 24 locations, is that when that probability, the trillions and billions, is that when that gets higher or lower?
That can play a factor because I have more locations to base statistical weight on. So if I detect data at 10 locations, for example, then I'm only basing a statistic on the locations that I'm able to make comparisons to. So in a degraded profile, the statistic can vary based on that amount of information. And as there's more information, the statistic is calculated based on more of those frequencies. So though that can have a factor on those numbers and what the statistics look like.
Thank you. Any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Any recross? No. Any other questions from the jury? All right. Thank you, ma'am. May this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may be excused, ma'am. Thank you. Have a good day. All right, it's just about lunchtime. So I think we're going to break for lunch. The next witness is not available until 1:30, so you'll get a little bit longer lunch today. We'll come back on the record at about 1:30. I think they've got lunch, hopefully almost here for you. Dr. Cole, you can come right up here to stand for me. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God?
I do.
Thank you, sir. You may have a seat. You may go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Could you please state and spell your name for the record?
Stephen with a PH, Cole, C-O-H-L-E.
Dr. Cole, where are you employed?
I'm employed in Grand Rapids. I'm the medical examiner for Kent County, and I work out of the Pelagic campus of Spectrum Health.
How long have you been employed in that capacity?
About 40 years.
And do you have a specialty?
Yes, forensic pathology.
What is your educational background? How does someone become a forensic pathologist?
Well, first, you have to graduate from college with a bachelor's degree. Then you go to medical school. In my case, I went to the University of Missouri at Columbia School of Medicine. For the next 4 years, one trains in pathology, which is basically hospital medicine. It involves looking at pieces of tissue under the microscope to make a diagnosis, as well as other hospital laboratory duties. After that's completed, then you train for a year in forensic pathology, where you actually do autopsies on people who have died of all kinds of problems, violence, drug overdose, sometimes unexpected natural death, that sort of thing. So that's 1 year. And then after that, hopefully you have to pass your specialty examinations, and you have to be licensed in the state for your practicing. And you're done, you're ready to work.
So a 4-year degree and then 3 years of medical school and then fellowship and then a residency, then a fellowship?
Yeah, 4 years of medical school.
Okay.
And then in my case, in most cases of forensic pathology, 4 years of postgraduate training in pathology, 1 year of fellowship in forensic pathology.
And you mentioned certifications and licensure.
Yes.
What is the status of those for you?
Well, I'm licensed to practice medicine in the state of Michigan, and I'm certified by the American Board of Pathology in anatomic pathology, clinical pathology, and forensic pathology.
Are you a member of any professional organizations?
Yes, the American Medical Association, our county medical examiner society, and several forensic organizations, particularly the National Association of Medical Examiners and the American Academy of Forensic Sciences.
Have you ever testified in court before?
I have,
How many times would you say?
I'd say 500 to 600 times.
And have you ever been qualified as an expert for your testimony?
Yes.
And what are you typically qualified as an expert in?
Well, pathology and forensic pathology.
Your Honor, I would move to qualify Dr. Cole as an expert in forensic pathology.
No objection.
Court would qualify him as an expert in forensic pathology.
Thank you. Doctor, what was your role in this case?
Well, I was asked to look at some slides of material that had been collected from the trunk of a car and to give an opinion as to what, if any, tissue was there. I think that's the initial thing is what tissue is this? Is it tissue at all, or is it just some debris that wasn't any kind of tissue at all? It turns out it was tissue.
Can you explain again to the jury? We've heard from a prior witness, but I'd like to hear from you. What is a slide?
Well, the slide is a rectangular piece of glass that contains a very thin slice of tissue, and that tissue is stained. And the idea is that you can look under the microscope at the tissue, and depends on what the question is. Decide, is there tissue there? What is the tissue? What's the origin of the tissue? And sometimes what disease is present on the tissue?
You said it was stained?
Stained, yes.
And what does that mean?
Well, in pathology, we use a variety of different chemicals that will stain tissue, and it'll stain different structures. So the most common of the stains that we use is called hematoxylin and eosin. Eosin stains red, hematoxylin stains blue. For most cells, you have a nucleus and the cytoplasm. The nucleus stains blue, the cytoplasm stains some shade of red generally.
These slides that you examined, did you make those?
I did not.
Do you know who did?
I believe it was Dr. Grayson.
And he was the medical examiner in 1983 in Newaygo County?
Yes.
Okay. Did you do anything besides look at those slides?
I took photographs.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Okay.
I'm handing you what has been marked as people's 91 through 96. Could you take a look at those, please?
Okay, I've had a chance to review them.
Thank you. Do you recognize those pictures?
I do. These are photographs or printed photographs that I took of the tissue from the car.
Okay. I would move to admit what's been marked as 91 through 96.
Any objection?
No.
Court would admit people's 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, and 96.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I publish those to the jury?
May.
Doctor, if you could see on that first picture, 91, which is also up on the screen, that's one of the pictures you took?
It is.
And what does that show?
Well, what we see are numerous red staining, roughly circular structures that are spread out. They're not touching each other. and those are skin cells.
How can you tell?
Well, skin cells, for example, if you were to take an abrasive item and scrape your skin, and especially if it's dry skin like this time of year, might get it to shed onto a slide, then you could stain that tissue. And this is what it would look like. The skin cells tend to be flattened, sort of disc-like, and though you can't see the nuclei really very well, they probably had already degenerated by the time this was made. These are absolutely characteristic of skin cells.
Nuclei is
The nucleus is a part of the cell, usually situated more or less in the middle, and it contains the genetic material to run that cell's to keep that cell going, and also sometimes it divides, and the cell can divide into other cells, and the nuclear contents, which is DNA mainly, is split between two different cells.
looking at people's, sorry. Thank you. Looking at people's 92, what is that? What is it that we're looking at here?
Well, this is a piece of tissue. The black stuff is just dirt, but the pink cells with the, you can kind of make out a purple and blue nucleus. That's a cluster of cells, probably the tissue right beneath the skin, I would say, more likely than not. It's really not specific for any tissue. And then at the top, and maybe you can point to it, there's a blood vessel. Or I can point to it. Yeah, that is right there that you're outlining with the red, a little bit of red stuff in it. That's a blood vessel. It's got some red blood cells in it, like it's supposed to have. I might just add that black blob on the right, that was a dot that the original pathologist put on the slide just to, so that he or anyone else reviewing the slide would find this piece of tissue. It's just what we do sometimes.
And in this picture, what does this show?
Well, this is another blood vessel. It's a little out of focus. That's why it looks blurry.
Is this, I'm sorry, is this 93?
This is
Correct.
93, yes. And the red material is red blood cells within the blood vessel.
So when you say a blood vessel, what do
Yes.
you mean?
Well, our blood is distributed throughout the body through basically tubes that branch, which are blood vessels. They are varied in size. And pretty much every organ, including the skin, has blood vessels within it to supply nutrition.
If I'm more familiar with the term vein or artery, are those blood vessels?
Yeah, that's two types of blood vessels, yes. I mean, I could talk more about them, but yes, those are examples.
Okay, thank you. And now we have 94, 95, and 96. If we could start with 94, what does this show?
Well, each of these shows liver, and liver cells are characterized by being pretty tightly cohesive, as these are. You can see the blue nuclei. The cytoplasm, which is the rest of the cell besides the nucleus, is sort of reddish, in varying shades of light red, kind of foamy looking in some cases. The red material is blood, so this piece of liver, or the liver from which this piece came, was damaged severely, so that literally broke loose pieces of the liver tissue, which then apparently leaked into the back of the vehicle. Where this tissue was recovered from. So that's 94.
And how do you recognize that as liver cells and differentiate that from another kind of cell?
Well, liver cells are characteristic. They, again, form just a solid mass of cells. There are some blood vessels in there, and there's some other tissue. that has to do with delivery of bile into the intestinal tract. But the vast majority of the bulk of the liver consists of tissue like this. The cells are not quite round. They're, I'd say, hexagonal, maybe 6-sided, but it could be 7 or 8-sided. But they are, so they have some angulation to their border, a central nucleus, and this cytoplasm, which is kind of, you get foamy in various shades of red, various intensities or intensity of red staining. So I guess I just have to say a part of it is actually basically, you know, if you're used to looking at this material, you just look at that and say, well, that's liver because it looks like liver. But I've tried to explain a little more, you know, how I come to that conclusion.
Fair to say you've looked at a lot of liver cells.
I have.
And 95?
Well, this is similar. Maybe right in the middle, we can make out a little detail where you can see that these cells each have a cell membrane that separates them from the adjacent cells. But this is quite similar to the prior photograph, including having the blood within and around this piece of liver.
And 96?
And just a higher power view also to show liver. And again, we see the blue nuclei, the reddish cytoplasm, and now this is basically like a sheet of cells. It's, I think that would be the best way to describe it. So they're not forming glands or any other structures. It's just cells that are in a sheet.
And you're very confident that these are indeed liver cells?
I am.
Okay. Now, do people shed liver cells? Am I leaving pieces of liver around me right now?
No.
Okay. How would these end up outside the body?
Well, there has to be a penetrating injury to the body in the region of the liver, which is on the right side, just beneath the ribs and the diaphragm on the right. So there has to be a penetrating injury, a gunshot wound, stab wound, or that's about it, really. Stab wound, I think I said, or gunshot wound. So there has to be a penetrating injury with damage to the liver so that literally pieces of liver are freed from the main mass of liver. And if the person, say, is shot, for example, in the front of the body and the bullet goes through the liver and there's damage, then after that, he or she would be laying face down in gravity. There would be bleeding coming out the wound as well as little pieces of liver.
Okay, and you mentioned that the liver is located on the right side of the body. Could you take a look at what people have marked as number 97?
Sure.
Can you describe what you're looking at generally?
Well, this is a diagram of the chest and abdomen of a male individual. It has the liver is shown in its location within the right upper part of the abdomen.
Okay, and does that reasonably show or reasonably accurately show the size and location of a human male liver?
It does.
Okay. May I admit this as number 97? Defense has a copy.
No objection. The court would admit 97.
Can I publish this, Your Honor?
You may.
Okay. Is that on the screen what you see in front of you?
Yes, it is.
Can you show, there's a green part. Is that the liver?
That's the gallbladder, which is attached to the liver. And basically, there is a duct or cylindrical piece of tissue that drains bile from the liver into the gallbladder, and then the bile leaves the gallbladder and goes into the small intestine, which is shown there in the diagram, and that helps dissolve fatty foods.
Now, this person in this diagram, this illustration, they're facing us. Is that right?
That's right.
So you stated this picture, is it fair to say that the liver is not symmetrical on both sides?
No, it's predominantly a right-sided organ. The right lobe is the main one, which would be just to the right of that sort of cleft, separates the liver into a large right lobe, a smaller left lobe.
So it's predominantly on the right side of the body.
Yes.
Now, if I were to be sitting like this, my liver would be here.
Yes, you're indicating the right side of your abdomen.
Okay, so if I were in the driver's seat of a car, my right side of the body and the main part of my liver would be facing the passenger seat.
That's right.
Now, you mentioned a penetrating injury, is that right?
I did.
And you said that could be a gunshot.
Yes.
Could a gunshot affect the liver if a person were seated like that in a car in their right side?
Yes.
Okay. And you mentioned that that kind of injury would cause bleeding from the right side as well?
It would.
One witness that the jury has heard from already testified that the victim's body was put in the trunk of a car after being shot in the driver's seat. Now, if that were the case, how would liver cells end up in the trunk of a car?
Well, the body would have to be in the trunk, and there would have to be a wound in the body through which pieces of liver that were damaged by, in this case, in this hypothetical at least, by the gunshot wound. So the gunshot wound will pass through the liver. It will not only make a hole, but the energy that it imparts to the liver will cause fragmentation of at least small parts of the liver. Depends on the caliber of the weapon and the velocity of the weapon. But even with a .22, there would be some degree of destruction of liver cells, which if the person's then put in the trunk and the right side of the body, either they're face down or the right side of the body's down toward the floor of the trunk, then blood and liver tissue would be expected to leak out.
So you would expect to see that.
I would.
And in the pictures we showed before, number 44, 94, 95, and 96, you do see damage to the liver tissue?
I see hemorrhage, bleeding, which would certainly be part and parcel of damage. The other thing is, this is just a little piece of liver. You don't just give a little piece of liver for no reason. It's got to have been broken off from the main mass of liver. So the fact that you see this piece is evidence that there was injury to the liver.
Okay. Now, are human liver cells easily distinguishable from animal liver cells?
If it's a mammal, like a deer or cow or something, no.
Okay, but if it were a non-mammal, yes?
I'd say you could probably tell the difference, though I don't have a lot of experience doing that kind of pathology. But mammalian liver would all look pretty much the same in a small piece. But if you had the whole liver, you could probably say, well, this is a human, or it's too big to be a human, or too small, but
okay,
just a piece.
Now, how would you go about telling forensically then with just a small piece of liver? Is there a method?
Well, yes, there are various methods, but basically looking DNA would be probably the best if you could perform that. There are less technological ways of telling. For example, if you have a serum made against with antibodies to human tissue, if it reacts with the tissue, then you could say, well, that's human, but probably DNA is better.
So if the court were to have admitted a report from the Michigan State Police Science Lab that used polymerase chain reaction to test that material from the trunk, from the same slides that you examined, and that it was attributable not to just a random Caucasian human, but 277 billion times more likely to come from a man with a specific DNA tested father and mother, what would you conclude?
Well, I would say that the tissue is not only human, it came from the person identified from whose parents the DNA was taken.
Now, you have multiple different slides, these liver pictures, blood vessels, skin cells. You said there's some blood cells in there as well.
Correct.
Would you expect to see that in the kind of penetrating injury you described?
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, because all kinds of tissue is damaged from the skin where the wound enters, whatever it is, bullet, for example, the underlying tissue, which would be connective tissue and fat, and then the liver itself. And furthermore, the fat, particularly in the upper skin layers, not the individual cells that are shed, those don't have access to a blood vessel, but the tissue right beneath it does have blood vessels. So that would all lead to what I have seen under the slides.
Now, this is probably a dumb question, but this kind of penetrating injury, would you describe that as a serious injury?
I would,
Would that require medical attention?
yes,
Is it potentially a lethal injury?
yes.
Based on the evidence that you have examined, what can you conclude? What would your general conclusion be about this evidence?
Well, in terms of whether it's a homicide or accident or something, violent death?
Just based on the slides you've examined and the pictures you took, can you conclude anything about what happened to this person?
Well, I would say yes, he or she received, maybe we already established this a male, so
Yes.
if we have, then I would say he received a serious and certainly life-threatening penetrating injury of the abdomen, which involved at least the liver.
Okay. Thank you. I have no more questions at this time.
Ms. Thorndike?
Yes. Good afternoon, Dr. Cole.
Good afternoon.
My name is Stephanie Korndike. I represent the defendant, Roy Snell, along with Ms. Smulders. I'm just going to ask you some questions. Bear with me. This is not my area of expertise, so I might be asking some silly questions, but based on what you reviewed in this case, can you definitively say that this was actually a homicide?
Could be an accident. It's a penetrating injury. So that's all I can say. It's well, I guess for that matter, could be a suicide, hypothetical.
Okay.
But whether any of those three would qualify as causing a penetrating injury, of the abdomen and liver.
Okay, so fair to say you would need more to make a specific determination?
I need history.
You talked about this penetrating wound. Based on what you reviewed, can you tell whether or not it was actually a gunshot wound versus a stabbing?
It's more likely a gunshot wound because bullets fired by a gun cause more damage than a stab wound. A stab wound would only damage tissue in its path, the path of the knife blade. Now that could, especially if the knife blade is twisted and it loosens up a little tissue, it certainly could result in similar findings. But I'd say, in general, more likely, much more likely that it's would be a gunshot wound.
But can you say definitively with the information that you have?
Well, no, I certainly wouldn't say there's no other possibility but a gunshot, for example. I'm just giving my relative likelihood of what it is.
Okay, thank you. Based on this specific evidence that you have, can you definitively say whether or not this was a lethal or non-lethal injury?
Well, I guess I can't say 100%. I think it's much more likely to be lethal because it was severe enough to damage the liver and have it leak out. And that would not be a trivial injury. However, again, I would want to have more information about from witnesses and what observations were made and that sort of thing, if that were possible.
When you're doing an autopsy, is that the type of information that you receive to help you make your final determination?
It's the kind of information I want. Doesn't mean I always get it.
Oh.
But yeah, the first step, and I'm not going to get into unasked questions, but the first step in an autopsy, especially a forensic one, is what is the history? What is the scene? So what happened to this person, and what, if there were witnesses, what were their observations? It's not, obviously, I don't have that in this case.
Okay. just based on the liver cells, can you tell the difference between liver cells and animal cells?
No, if it's a, say, a mammal such as a cow or chimpanzee or something, no, just the liver is going to look the same, especially if these little pieces are all going to look the same.
So in order to determine, and I believe you maybe answered this undirected, just I want to clarify. In order to determine the difference between an animal liver and a human liver, you would need more of the liver to determine size and shape and those kinds of
Well,
things.
yes, if I had the whole liver, for example, I think I could usually give an opinion as to whether it's human or animal. Certainly little pieces like this, you can't tell at all.
Do you recall testifying at a preliminary examination in this case back in 2020?
Yes,
At that time, you testified that the liver or the tissue was suggestive of liver cells. I believe that's on page 61 to 62 in the preliminary transcript, about 18 to through 25 for clarity, if anybody wants to follow along. When you use the term suggestive, does that mean that you can't definitively tell that these are liver cells?
well, there really isn't anything else they could be. I mean, there's no other tissue. Perhaps I used the wrong word back then, but my opinion is that those are liver cells, and I just don't have any other options. There's no other tissue that would look like that.
Okay. No other tissue in the human body, or just no other tissue that you know of?
Well, none that I know of. Now, of course, I'm most familiar, obviously, with human tissues, but I can't even think of an organ or something in an animal that would have that appearance.
Okay. You testified on direct that the material you analyzed came from the trunk of a car.
That's what I was told.
Okay, you were told that? You didn't collect those samples?
I did not.
Okay. Can you determine the age of a sample?
Like in this case, the time that the tissue was actually deposited in the car. I mean, or how long it had been there before it was collected. Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it is, but I
Yes,
want
yes,
you
that's
to
the
ask.
question. Yes, yes. Can you determine how old
Yeah.
a sample is?
I can estimate. There's
Okay.
no scientific way. The liver cells were, in general, in pretty good shape and, in my opinion, identifiable as such. I think that, but I can only be general. It may be that they've been there, I'd say, or to answer the question more precisely, I would think a week or two, this is just an estimate, or less. And I say that because eventually what's going to happen is there are bacteria, certainly from presumably the car, wherever they were recovered from, these tissues. The bacteria would destroy the tissue totally. It would be unrecognizable totally. Well, this is still not, the cells are in pretty good shape. So I would tend to think no more than a week or two. And the last thing I'll say is there's some other variables. However, if it's cold, that's like refrigerating the tissue and it'll stay intact longer. If it's really hot, that'll accelerate the decomposition process.
Okay. Let me confer with my co-counsel and I'll be right back. Couple more questions. Forgive me if these are silly. If a person were to receive a gunshot wound, would you be able to see gunpowder residue on the slides or in the tissue?
No, ma'am.
Okay,
No, just perhaps on the skin, if the weapon were close enough to deposit that residue on the skin. Or the clothing, but we don't have either. So.
okay, thank you. And then do you know how much liver actually leaked out of the individual?
Well, I don't. The only thing I had to review were very small pieces of tissue and that were put on slides. Again, I wasn't at the scene in terms of seeing the trunk of the car. I'm assuming, and actually I know Dr. Grazer, but I assume that he or the investigator with whom he worked picked whatever they thought might be tissue. And if that's the case, it's just little tiny bits.
Okay. Let me confirm one more. No further questions.
Doctor, you stated that in general, you like to get additional information from the scene or from witness observations?
Yes,
In this case, you didn't have that.
I did not.
Okay, so all of your conclusions are based on these slides that you received.
That's right.
Thank you. I have no more questions.
Any questions from the jury? Surrender, Dr. Rich.
I get moved.
All right, one of the questions from the jury, does the liver tissue contain DNA?
Yes, in the nucleus.
Did you test the liver tissue that you had for DNA?
No, I did not.
Any follow-up?
Yes, please.
Okay.
If this liver tissue were found in a globule with these blood vessels, the blood, the skin, would it be reasonable to conclude that that all has the same DNA in it?
Yes.
Thank you.
Ms. Thorndike?
No follow-up, Your Honor.
Any other questions from the jury? May this witness be excused?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, doctor. You're all set. You may
Yes, Your
step
Honor.
down and you can leave those exhibits right there, someone will collect
I'll
them.
do that.
Thank you. Watch your step. Mr. Prosecutor, your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor, our next witness is Gail Rushlow, who is on Zoom.
Ms. Anna, do you see her?
I do.
Oh, great. Are you ready for me to bring her in?
You're ready.
All right, you can bring her in, Ms. Anna.
Right here.
2, 3.
So three. Just one.
Your audio is just connecting, Judge. You just stand like right here.
That's right. Thank you.
There you go. Anywhere in there.
I think she just saw us and got up.
Yep, she got up.
Right.
Miss Rushlow, can you hear me?
I don't think she can hear us yet, Judge.
Oh, she's still joining? Yep. Okay. She's still joining her audio. I can't see on the bottom. Is it muted? Mhm.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, she's getting assistance. That's usually. Can you hear me?
Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Are we good?
All good.
Thank you. Are you Gail Rushlow?
Yes, I am.
Thank you, Ms. Rushlow. They subpoenaed you to testify today. Are you prepared to provide testimony now?
Yep.
All right. Ms. Rushlow, can you state your name for the record?
Gail A. Rushlow.
And can you raise your right hand for me? Do you solemnly swear, oath, or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. Ms. Rushlow, can you tell me if there's anyone else in the room that you're sitting in today?
Just the deputy.
All right. And can you spell your first and last name for me?
Gail, Gail, Rushlow, Rushlo.
Thank you, ma'am. The attorney's going to ask you some questions. If you have a hard time hearing, just let us know and he will say it again, okay?
Okay.
Thank you. You may go ahead, Mr. Gunderson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can you hear me all right, Ms. Rushlow?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Where are you testifying from today?
Salem, Oregon.
Okay. And you're at the police department there?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for joining us by Zoom. Ms. Rushlow, have you always lived in Salem, Oregon?
No, I moved out here in 2007.
Okay. And where did you live before that?
Michigan, Grand Rapids.
Okay. I want to take you back to the year 1983. Did you live in Grand Rapids, Michigan at that time?
I wasn't living there. I was going back and forth
Okay. Where were you going back and forth from?
from Carroll, Michigan to Grand Rapids, Michigan.
And why were you going to Grand Rapids?
Friends owned the motel and I went down on weekends to help out and stuff.
Okay. Who are your friends?
Dorothy and Bonnie Bazan,
Okay. And what motel did they own?
Green Acres Motel. No, Gateway Motel.
Okay. And you said you were helping them out?
Yes.
What were you helping them out with?
Taking care of Bonnie. She had muscular dystrophy, and if they needed to go after truck drivers or errands, I do that.
Okay. Did you ever work in the motel at the desk or something like that?
At nighttime, yes.
Okay. And can you describe the Gateway Motel for us? Where in Grand Rapids was it?
Off of 28th Street.
Okay. And what kind of place was the Gateway Motel?
It's a family-owned, friendly, truck drivers would come once in a while and vacationers and stuff like that.
Okay. And when you worked at the front desk at the Gateway Motel, first of all, how long did you work there for?
I don't know because I would go on weekends and then go back home to do my other job.
Okay. If you were to estimate, couple years, more or less?
I would say on and off, probably a total of 5 years going back and forth.
And you said that you would work at the front desk during nights?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if I wanted to check into the Gateway Motel in 1983, what would I have to do? Do I have to fill something out?
Yeah, you would fill out a registration card.
Okay. And the court has previously admitted copies of these. Actually, can I get these to you? Yeah, sorry.
Any special order?
Nope. Ma'am, do you have any documents in front of you?
Yes, I do.
What do you have in front of you?
I have a registration card. And I have a phone list.
Okay, now let's start with that registration. Start with that phone list, please, if you could look at that first. And back in 1983, did you have the opportunity to speak with a detective?
I don't recall back in 1983.
This phone list, we've previously admitted this as People's Exhibit 53, and it's also been marked, the original is People's 98. How do you recognize this phone list, ma'am?
It's where the rooms would call long distance phone numbers and then the operators would call back and we would write it down on paper.
Okay. I would move for admission of what's been marked as People's 98.
No, court would admit 98.
May I publish this to the jury?
You
now?
may.
It's up on the screen and also maybe start. Can you describe what's on that sheet for us, Ms. Rushlow?
The room numbers, the time they made the call and for how long, and the phone number and how much it would cost.
Okay. Now, you're putting the room number, there's a blank for room number, but there are some letters in there. Is the room number put somewhere else on this sheet?
No,
Could you take a look at the left side of that sheet? What does it say at the top?
voucher number,
Is that where you're putting the room number?
yes.
Okay. And next to that, what do you put in the next blank where it says name or party calling?
What time they made the call and for how long they talked.
So if you could look down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and blanks 8 and 9, do you see where it says under voucher number where you're putting the room number, room 20? What does it say in the next box for the time under those two?
The first one is 8:53 for 10 minutes. And the second one is at 9:03 for 1 minute.
Okay. Where it says room number, it says CFO. What does that mean?
The operator initials.
Okay. After that, that's where the phone numbers are.
Correct.
And those both have an area code of 689.
Well, the area code isn't 689. That's the phone number.
Oh, I'm sorry. So it's 689-1786 and
Right.
689-6163.
Right.
Okay. What are the numbers in the next box?
How much they charge for it. The first one is
And
$286. And the second one's $1.50 or 54, I'm not sure.
right. And when you say they charge, you're talking about the phone company?
Yes,
Right. Now, after that, what comes after that in those blanks?
the tax, and then the guest charge, the total with the tax added. And then, who collected the money or who took the call?
Okay, and those are initials of who took that call?
Yes,
And by took the call, you mean who the operator called at the front desk?
yes,
All right, and are there initials in there?
yes.
And what are those initials?
DB,
And who is that?
Dorothy Bazan. She was
That's
the
the
owner.
friend? Okay, and that's the friend that you mentioned before?
Yeah, and her daughter Bonnie.
Okay. Now, how did you organize these by date at the front desk? How did you know what day these calls were made?
The day is, like today would be the 9th. So you would put 9 down.
Okay, so these calls, are they in a specific order? When you kept this, did you have individual sheets or did you keep it in a book?
Sheets like this and like by the initials, like the numbers for DB, it would be 1111, that would be the 11th day.
Okay, so these are kept in chronological order, is that right?
Right.
So if someone were to come to you and say, I need to see August 10th and August 11th, would you be able to pull those calls out of that book?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if you could turn and look at that other page you have, the registration card.
Mm-hmm.
And what is this registration card? When would you get this at the front desk?
The cards are all blank, and when a customer would come in, we would grab a card and put it on the desk and let them fill it out.
Okay, so the guest would fill this out, is that right?
Correct.
Would it be fair to say it looks like there's more than one kind of handwriting on this card?
There would be about 2.
Wait, just a minute. There's an objection.
I'll rephrase the question.
Just a minute. He's going to ask it again.
Did the guest fill out all of the card, or would the person working at the front desk do part of it?
People at front desk would do part of it, finish it up.
Okay, which part would the front desk worker do?
Fill in the date down on the bottom when they checked in, and the amount, and the room number, and the $2 is the $2 key deposit, and we write down the trucker, so we know it was a trucker that needed a wake-up call at 6 a.m.
Okay. Now is it fair to say on part of this card, there's lists a make of car?
Yes,
And what is under that blank?
truck.
Look at this card very closely under make of car. Can you see that all right?
Yes, it says truck. He was a truck driver.
Are you looking at a car that says Mike Roberts Jr. at the top?
No, I'm got one that says Jack Snell.
Okay, I want you to look at the registration card that says Mike Roberts Jr. at the top.
I don't have it. I have 2 Jacks.
You have 2 what?
2 Jack Snell.
Can you screen share it with me?
I don't know how to do that.
Okay. Hang on just a minute. Anna, you know how to screen share?
Only if it's showing on the Zoom app, but because it's on their computer, I can't.
Right,
They're not
but if we
logged
get it to you, then you should be able to screen share.
in. You should be able to.
He emails it to you? We're gonna get you a copy of that, Miss Rushlow, so you can see it. If you just hang tight for me for 1 minute.
Okay. I found it.
Oh, great. That makes it a lot easier. Okay. So I'm gonna let him ask you again. Make sure you have the right one. Go ahead, Mr.
Thank you. Could you have the card in front of you that says Mike Roberts Jr.?
Yes.
All right. Could you look at the blank where it says make of car?
Trans Am.
Thank you. And how many people in the party?
2.
Who would fill out the make of car and the number of people in the party, the guest or the front desk?
The guest.
Okay. And it also lists an address on there, right?
Right.
All right. And that's Cleveland, Ohio.
Correct.
Now, would you double check that address or do you just let them put whatever they want?
Just let them put their address.
All right. And what is the date on this registration card?
8/10/83.
All right. And was it typical for you to keep these registration cards and these phone lists as part of your job at working at the front desk?
It wasn't hard to keep them, no.
I'm sorry, let me say that. Was it part of your job, the people who worked at the front desk, to keep these records?
Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Rushlow. I have no further questions at this time. There's another attorney who's going to be asking you questions, okay?
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Rushlow. Just one moment.
I also want to move to admit what's been marked as People's 99.
And 98.
I think I did 98.
Court would admit 99. Sorry. No objection, Ms. Mulder.
Oh, that's all right. If you want to use it, sure.
No objection. Court would admit 99 and 98 if I didn't do so already.
All right, Gail, how are you?
Good.
Good. Can you hear and see me okay?
Yep.
Okay. My name's Valerie Smulders. I'm another attorney here and I represent the defendant here, okay?
Okay.
I'm going to ask you just kind of a series of follow-up questions and hopefully I don't take too long for you here. So do you recall previously testifying in this case before, approximately around 2020?
I don't recall.
Do you recall ever talking to this court before?
No,
Concerning your,
I just talked to a bunch of people, bunch of guys.
okay. Well, let me ask you this. Do you remember back in 2020, I believe around May or June of 2020, Zooming in at some point to talk to some people concerning this case?
I don't recall, no.
You don't recall ever being testifying to this case and being put under oath?
I don't recall because I've been going back and forth all the time, thinking it
Sure.
would be done, but then they said it's just talking, and then now today's hearing, so, you know.
Okay, you don't ever remember raising your right hand and somebody asking you if you
No.
swear under oath? No, okay. All right. Well, then let me ask you some of these questions here. Do you remember ever talking before to anyone and you were questioned whether or not you recall seeing a man named Ricky or Richard Atwood at your hotel?
That name don't even sound familiar.
Okay, were you ever given a picture of somebody and asked if you could identify that?
I don't recall because way back in the 83s and stuff, I don't remember anything.
Okay, all right. Let me ask you this. What, and if there is, was there a common ethnicity of people that would stay at your hotel during that 1983 time period?
There would be a lot of people. I don't remember what people looks like or nothing.
Okay, so there would be Caucasian people,
Yeah.
correct? Okay,
Mhm.
African American
Yep.
people, Hispanic people,
Mm-hmm.
okay. Specifically looking at the date of August 10th, 1983, do you recall a Caucasian man and an African American man coming in together to your lobby to check out a hotel room?
I don't remember.
You don't, okay. Going back to the process of how you registered guests, you explained that some parts you or another hotel employee would fill out, and some parts the guest would fill out. You recall saying that?
Correct.
Okay. On this exhibit that is marked 99, and it's that registration card with Mike Roberts as the name. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes.
Okay. Do you recall specifically what parts are in your handwriting and what are not in your handwriting?
The date below and the amount.
Okay, wait, the date below is what? Yours or not yours?
That is mine.
Okay. What else is yours?
The amount, 2285,
Okay,
and the room number, 20,
okay,
and LD means long distance. And key,
okay,
$2,
okay,
and that's it.
okay. And I don't know about your copy, but my copy, I assume it translates, well, I assume you have a photocopy, but I have the original here. Does it look like the handwriting that says Mike Roberts is similar to yours and different than the Trans Am handwriting?
It looks different, but it's not my writing.
It's not your writing, okay. Was anybody else that you recall working at the lobby during that time period?
No.
Okay. I know it's a long time ago. Was there ever a time where there was more than just you working the lobby?
Yes, my friend, Bonnie Bazan, she was in a wheelchair, so she was sitting in the lobby and I was her arms and legs.
Okay. So is it possible that you were not just working alone that night?
Right.
Okay. And I think you testified earlier that you don't verify an address, correct?
What do you
Meaning the
mean?
address that a guest is indicating
No.
they reside at on a card?
No, we don't
No.
verify.
Okay. Was it common procedure at all to check somebody's ID when they registered?
No.
No. Okay. What is the age requirements to register at your hotel? Is there a minimum age requirement to rent a room?
I have no idea, but I would probably say about 18.
Okay. Do you recall ever talking to this court stating that you confirmed you didn't check IDs at the time unless they looked too young? Is that something that you recall saying?
I might have, but I don't remember what I've said to you guys.
Okay, well, is that something that you would commonly practice back then?
Yes.
Okay. And do you have, or did you have an age threshold that you were supposed to be maybe checking IDs for? Meaning, an example, in Michigan, at least, you have to be 21 to buy alcohol.
Correct.
Most places have signs that say, if you look 40 or under, we're going to check your ID. Maybe you didn't have a strict policy, but was there a common age that you would want to check their ID for?
I would say not unless they look suspicious.
Okay. So you don't recall age having anything
No.
to do with the reason to check your ID? Okay, I'm gonna hold on 1 second, okay? All right, we're gonna come back to that, but I'm gonna kind of move forward. You just testified today that you worked weekends at the Gateway Motel. Is that correct?
Repeat that?
You testified a few minutes earlier today that you worked the weekends at the Gateway Hotel. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Okay. And was that kind of your normal shift?
well, yeah, because during the week I was working in Carroll making carburetors and fuel pumps. And then on my
Okay.
days off, I would go down there and help out.
Okay. What is the procedure? Well, strike that. Do you recall the layout of the Gateway Motel in terms of where the lobby is or the registration is and in relation to the rooms?
Back then it was like a L shape where it was ground floor and the lobby would be in the middle. And then in the center, there was a 2-story building with rooms and it had a swimming pool.
So then in relation to specifically room 20, would that have been visible from the lobby?
Yes,
Okay. So you could see who was coming and going?
yeah, but we didn't pay attention.
Sure, but you could if you would.
Yeah.
Were paying attention, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And could you also see the entirety of the parking lot from the lobby as well? Or was there parking lot behind the lobby? Or can you explain to the court how that is laid out?
The parking lot would be in front where the
Okay.
motel was.
Okay. So you could see the entire parking lot from the
Yeah.
lobby itself, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And do you recall being questioned before if you've ever seen this Trans Am car that is indicated on this hotel registration for Mike Roberts? Do you recall seeing that Trans Am car in the parking lot
No,
ever? No, okay. Do you recall seeing anybody that checked in or out that was muddy in appearance on
no,
August 10th or 11th
no.
of 1983? No. Can you explain to me the checkout procedure the next day or however long their stay is? So what one would have to do to check out of the hotel?
Well, sometimes when you check out, they didn't come down to the office. Sometimes they just leave the key in the room. And sometimes they would come, if they come down to the office and turn in their key, then they get their $2 back.
Okay. So some people just didn't care about their $2
Right.
deposit, okay? What about though, I mean, how do you account for rooms where long distance calls were made? Because they don't prepay for any long distance, correct?
Correct.
So what about in that scenario? How does one check out?
Well, if they're smart enough and they know that they made long distance calls, they would come down to the office and pay. But there's times where we had people that didn't pay their long distance.
Okay. And do you have any way of telling from the records that you have and that we've talked about today, knowing whether or not room 20 paid their long distance phone calls?
Yes, they did.
They did.
Mhm.
Okay, so it would be reasonable to assume that person or persons came back the next day to pay.
Correct.
Okay. And at that point, even, you never saw a Trans Am vehicle in the parking lot, correct?
Correct, depending on who checked him out or whatever, you know?
Sure. When you work, do you ever work, like the third shift, or what would be your hours be when you did work?
I would work when Bonnie was up because I was her arms and legs.
So that would vary times, or there was
she-
a general?
She would go to bed at a certain time, I don't recall what time, and then she would stay in bed until her mom was able to start giving her a bath and getting her up and everything. So,
Okay. Do you know who worked on August 11th, 1983?
I don't recall at all.
Okay. Do you know who Mike Roberts is? Are you familiar with him?
No,
Do you recall a Mike Roberts ever checking into your hotel before
no,
or after August 10th?
no,
Okay. Do you recall somebody by the name of Ricky Atwood or Richard Atwood
no,
checking into your hotel ever?
no.
Okay. So this process of long distance calls, was that common during that time period? Was it known that that's the procedure where the operator has to connect with you to inform you how much
Yes,
money essentially it costs?
yes.
And would it be normal procedure? Well, no, strike that. How would the operator know what room to apply the charges to? Did each room have a specific phone number, or how did that work?
Each room had I don't know if it was the same phone number or different phone number, but they would have to tell them what room they were in.
So the person making the call would have to tell them what
Yes.
room they were. Okay. So this was common practice during that time period?
Yes,
Okay. So then someone who would be making a call, who was a guest at a hotel, would know they would have to say the room number they were in, would know that their call would be monitored for the duration, for the phone number that they're calling to. They would know all of this information prior to placing a call, correct?
yeah, yes.
All right, I'm gonna confer with co-counsel here real quick.
Just one moment, Ms. Rushlow.
I know you stated earlier to the other attorney that was up here that you don't recall talking to any detectives or police back in 1983, correct?
Correct.
Do you recall the first time you were questioned about this date in this case?
I don't know what year, but it was when I was out in Oregon.
And that was the first time?
Yep.
And what year were you out in Oregon approximately after 1983? I mean, are we talking 5 years, 10 years?
I moved out to Oregon in 2007. So I've been out here for about 15 years.
Okay. So then the first time you talked to the police regarding this case, there was 20, 30 years that had passed essentially
Correct.
from that date.
Correct.
So a lot of your memory is difficult to pinpoint exact details, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And were these hotel cards, after somebody has checked out, were they placed anywhere? Were they kept for a period of time? Was there any procedure regarding that?
As far as I know, they were kept at least for 7 years or so.
Okay. Were they in a secure place for 7 years, or were they in, an unsecure place?
I think a secured place.
Okay. Do you
In
know
a
where that
box?
would be?
No,
In a box?
I don't know where. it would
Locked
be.
box?
Pardon?
When we say secured, I guess I was meaning more like locked area where people
No.
cannot have direct.
Probably down in the basement or wherever,
Okay. All right. I'm going to throw a couple other names out there. I know you stated you don't recall a Richard or Ricky Atwood or a Mike Roberts. Do you recall a Charles Brown ever staying at your hotel or checking in?
No,
How about a Roy Snell?
no,
How about a Walter Sanders?
no.
No other questions. Thank you very much.
Mr. Gunderson?
Yeah.
Ma'am, do you remember any guests from August 1983?
No,
Do you remember anyone's car from August 1983?
no.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
Ms. Small? Oh, sorry, no, it's all right. Any questions from the jury? May this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, Ms. Rushlow. You are all set for today. You may exit the Zoom meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Prosecutor, any other witnesses for today's purposes?
No, Your Honor.
The jury, I guess, getting out a little early today. We have another witness that will be lengthy and not available today. As I told you when we started, the courthouse is closed on Friday for Veterans Day, so we will not meet on Friday. We will be back here Monday at 8:30. I'll caution you over the long weekend or weekend. Again, not to talk about the case with anybody, research any topics or look anything